The last embers in the grate had just begun to soften into a steady orange when Baker Street turned the color of wet ink, and the rain came down with the patient insistence of a thing that had all night to work. It was the kind of weather London wore like a second skin, fog clinging low, gaslight blurred into halos, the sound of wheels on slick stone carried farther than it ought to. Inside 221B, the familiar warmth held, but it did not fully chase away the chill that lived in the window panes. Dr. John Watson had grown accustomed to the odd hours and odd silences of that sitting room. The armchair by the fire, the chemical odors that never quite left the air, the violin resting like a sleeping animal on the sofa, these were features of his life now, no longer curiosities. Yet there were evenings when even routine seemed to hesitate, as if London itself paused on the stair outside. Sherlock Holmes stood at the mantel, not reading, not smoking, not playing. He was simply listening. His head was slightly inclined, his eyes half-lidded, and his long fingers held a small brass lens that he had not yet raised to anything. To watch him in such moments was to understand that his stillness was not emptiness. It was attention sharpened to a fine point. "You are waiting," Watson said at last, not quite a question. Holmes did not look over. "I am hearing," he replied, and the calmness of his voice was almost an affront to the storm beyond the glass. Watson set down his tea. The cup clinked softly against the saucer, one small, human sound in a room that often seemed arranged for greater ones. For what? For the thing that arrives before it is announced. Watson might have smiled at that once, but there was something in the way Holmes said it, something that did not invite humor. The rain thickened. A gust pressed itself against the window, and for a moment the glass vibrated as though the house breathed. Then below them a footfall on the stair. Not the slow tread of Mrs. Hudson, not the familiar rhythm of a policeman's boot, not the careless bound of a messenger boy. This was measured, professional, the kind of step that had learned to be quiet without ever needing to be. Holmes moved before Watson did. He crossed to the door and opened it as though he had already decided, from the sound alone, what would be standing there. A courier waited on the landing, tall, wrapped in a dark coat that shed water in rivulets, cap brim lowered. His face was ordinary enough to be forgotten, which was often the surest mark of someone paid to go unnoticed. He did not speak. He did not even step inside. He simply extended a flat parcel, held in both hands as if it were fragile or dangerous. Holmes took it. Their fingers did not touch. Only when the courier's hand withdrew did Watson notice the subtle tremor in it, the small, involuntary shiver a man makes when he wishes to appear composed, but cannot quite compel his muscles to agree. Holmes closed the door and turned the parcel in the lamplight. It was an envelope, thick, cream-colored, of the kind used for legal instruments or private correspondence of high consequence. It bore no return address, yet it had an official stamp impressed near the flap, a neat oval mark with an emblem that suggested authority rather than beauty. Watson leaned forward, squinting. "That is odd." Holmes said nothing. His thumb traced the raised edges of the stamp with a delicacy that might have been tenderness if his eyes had not been so coldly alert. "What is it?" Watson asked. "A letter," Holmes said. Watson made a sound of impatience. "I gathered that." Holmes brought the envelope closer to the lamp. "Not merely a letter that wants to be believed." He tilted it so Watson could see the stamp more clearly. In the lamplight, the ink revealed itself, dark, but not black, with a faint metallic sheen that suggested it had been mixed carefully, perhaps in a place where documents were meant to last. Watson read the printed line beneath the emblem, and his brow furrowed. Crown Repository. Holmes's eyes flicked to him. "You recognize it?" "I recognize the name, not the stamp," Watson said. "A government archive, is it not, for sealed records?" "Among other things," Holmes murmured. Watson's attention moved to the date line impressed beside it. He read it once, then again, certain he had misread in the odd angle of the light. "Holmes," he said quietly, "that cannot be right." Holmes did not correct him. He simply handed Watson the envelope. Watson's fingers closed around it, and he felt at once the peculiar weight of it, not heavy, precisely, but substantial, as though its contents were more than paper. He brought it closer and stared at the date. It was not merely wrong, it was impossible. It suggested a year decades beyond the present, stamped with the indifferent certainty of bureaucracy, as if time itself had been filed away and called up again when needed. Watson's throat tightened. "This is a mistake." Holmes watched him in the way a physician watches a patient's pupils. "Is it?" Watson looked at the address. The handwriting was neat, slanted slightly forward, and so controlled it seemed to deny the possibility of haste. It was addressed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London. No flourish, no error, no hesitation. Watson knew hundreds of hands. He had seen the tremor of the aged, the swagger of the proud, the careless loops of those born to comfort. This hand did not announce its owner. It was educated and restrained, like a voice deliberately softened. "It is not yours," Watson said. Holmes's mouth twitched faintly. "No. It is not Mrs. Hudson's. No. And I have never seen it," Watson added, surprised by the certainty of his own voice. Holmes nodded once. "Nor I." Watson turned the envelope over. The flap was sealed with wax, deep burgundy, almost brown, pressed with a signet whose design was not immediately clear. Yet what caught Holmes's attention, and then Watson's, was not the emblem but a fault in the wax itself, a hairline fracture running from the edge toward the center, as if the seal had once been broken and then persuaded back into place. Watson held it closer, his medical eye trained for subtle damage. "It's been opened." Holmes took it back. "It has been opened," he agreed, "and resealed by someone who believes himself careful." "How can you tell?" Watson asked. Holmes brought the wax near the lamp. "The surface has been warmed. The gloss is inconsistent. There is a slight bleed at the edge where the wax softened and touched the paper anew. Whoever did it had patience and the proper implements, but he did not have the original hand's confidence. The fracture remains because he feared pressing too firmly." Watson felt a small, uneasy thrill, the familiar blend of admiration and dread. It was one thing to be clever. It was another to have one's cleverness aimed at the intimate details of a sealed thing meant only for Holmes. Outside, rain tapped at the window as if it wished to join the conversation. Holmes slid a thin blade from his pocket, not a dagger, not a weapon, but a simple tool of precision, and inserted it beneath the wax with such care that Watson could not help thinking of surgery. The wax lifted. The flap opened with a dry whisper. Holmes did not yet remove the contents. He paused, and for the first time that evening Watson noticed something like caution in him. Not fear, certainly, but an awareness that some doors, once opened, do not close neatly again. A sudden pounding at the door below shattered the moment. Not the polite knock of a caller, not the brisk rap of a messenger. This was desperate, 3 blows in quick succession, then a pause, then 2 more, as if the hand belonged to a man who did not know whether to beg entry or demand it. Mrs. Hudson's voice rose faintly from downstairs, startled, then hushed by another urgent sound. Holmes's eyes met Watson's. "There," he said softly, "now we have our announcement." He crossed the room and opened the door of the flat before Mrs. Hudson could ascend. A figure stumbled onto the landing, breath steaming in the cold stairwell air. The man was in his early 30s perhaps, neatly dressed despite the rain, his hair plastered slightly to his forehead where his hat had been snatched off in haste. His coat was of good quality, his collar turned up, and yet there was something in his posture that suggested he had forgotten he was wearing it. His face was pale, not the pallor of illness, but of anxiety carried too long without relief. His eyes moved quickly, not taking in the room so much as measuring it for threats. He tried to speak and failed on the first attempt. Then he cleared his throat with a dry, embarrassed sound. "Mr. Holmes," he said. "Sherlock Holmes." Holmes stepped aside. "You have found him." The man entered, hesitated just inside the threshold, and then glanced back down the stair as if he half expected someone to be following. Only when Holmes closed the door did his shoulders drop a fraction. He saw Watson then and gave a stiff nod that was meant to be polite but came out as wary. "Dr. Watson." Watson's eyebrows lifted. "You know me." "I know of you," the man corrected quickly, and his gaze flicked to the envelope on the table as if drawn by gravity. "It's here, then." Holmes's voice was even. "You seem relieved and terrified at once. That is not a comfortable combination. Sit down, mister." The man swallowed. "Harrow, Elias Harrow." Holmes did not offer his own name again, nor did he pretend not to have guessed it. "Mr. Harrow," he said, "you have run up Baker Street in the rain and nearly broken my door. That suggests either urgency or poor manners. I will assume urgency for your sake." Harrow did not sit. He stood too straight, hands clasped tightly in front of him, fingers white at the knuckles. His eyes kept returning to the opened envelope like a penitent looking at a confession. "I am an archivist," Harrow said. "Crown Repository. I manage sealed collections." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Then the stamp is genuine." Harrow flinched as if the word genuine was dangerous. "The stamp is real," he said carefully, "but that date is not. It cannot be." Watson watched him, noting the way his lips tightened on certain syllables. This was a man trained to speak precisely, and now precision was failing him. Holmes leaned against the mantel, relaxed in posture but not in attention. "You have come to tell me that a letter from your archive has been stolen." Harrow shook his head too quickly. "Not stolen, not exactly." He took a step toward the table, stopped himself, and then spoke as if forcing each word through a narrow gate. "That letter was never meant to leave. It was sealed. It was locked away in a collection that requires 3 signatures to access. It should not be in private hands. It should not be in your rooms." Holmes glanced at the opened flap, "And yet it is." Harrow's throat bobbed. "If it is read, Mr. Holmes, it could unmake a man's name." Watson felt the phrase land in the room with weight. Not ruin, not destroy, unmake. As if reputation were not something built but something crafted, and with the right blow reshaped into nothing. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Whose name?" Harrow's gaze dropped. "That is part of the problem." Holmes stepped closer, not abruptly, not threateningly, but with the quiet inevitability of someone approaching a truth. "Mr. Harrow," he said, "you are frightened. I do not doubt that, but fear does not absolve you of clarity. If you have come to stop me reading it, you are too late. If you have come to ask my help, you must give me something to work with." Harrow swallowed again, his hands unclasped and reclasped as if he could not decide what to do with them. "I did not know," he said finally. "I did not know it was missing until this morning." Holmes's head tilted a fraction. "Yet you arrived within an hour of its delivery." Harrow's eyes widened. "How?" Holmes lifted a finger gently, a polite interruption. "The courier was trained. He did not speak, he did not linger, but his coat is wet only on the shoulders and sleeves, not at the hem. That means he came from a covered conveyance, likely a closed cab. He took precautions, so did whoever employed him. You did not stumble upon this at leisure, Mr. Harrow. You were waiting for it, or you were warned." Harrow's lips parted. He said nothing. Watson saw then, for the first time, the difference between fear and guilt. Fear widens the eyes. Guilt makes them look away. Holmes's voice remained mild. And the seal, he continued. It has been opened. That fracture is old, not fresh. Someone handled this letter before the courier ever climbed my stairs. Harrow's breath caught. No. Holmes leaned in slightly. Yes. Harrow shook his head, and the movement was small, almost childlike. It was sealed. It has always been sealed. Holmes's eyes flicked to Watson, a silent invitation. Watson stepped closer and held the envelope nearer to Harrow's face. Look, Watson said, keeping his tone professional. The wax, the surface, it has been warmed. Harrow stared. A sheen of sweat appeared at his temple despite the cold. It cannot, his voice thinned. No one has the authority. Holmes's expression did not change. Authority is a word men cling to when they wish the world to be tidy. Harrow closed his eyes for a moment, as if bracing. When he opened them, something in him had shifted. The rehearsed firmness had drained away, leaving the raw urgency beneath. The collection, he said, is sealed for a reason. It is not merely government secrets. It is lives. It is letters, records, confessions, things written to be buried because they would destroy people who are no longer able to defend themselves. Some of it is blackmail, some of it is mercy. He hesitated on that last word as if it tasted strange. Holmes's gaze sharpened further. Mercy is a dangerous word in an archive. Harrow's voice dropped. The letter speaks of a death, he said, a death that has not yet happened. Watson felt his spine tighten. The idea was absurd. No, worse than absurd. It felt like superstition dressed in official paper. Holmes did not flinch, and Harrow licked his lips. And it contains a confession. It implicates someone you once spared. Watson looked sharply at Holmes. In the firelight, Holmes's face remained composed, but there was a faint tightening at the corner of his mouth, a small signal, like a violin string drawn taut. You are certain, Holmes said quietly. Harrow nodded once, abruptly, as though unable to bear the weight of repeated confirmations. I have not read it, he added quickly, perhaps sensing the accusation that would follow. I have not, but I know what it is. I know what it was catalogued as. I know what it can do. Holmes's fingers moved to the paper within the envelope. He slid it out slowly. The sheet was thick, crisp, and carried that faint smell of old storage, dry paper and sealing wax and dust that has been undisturbed for years. Yet it did not look old. It looked prepared, preserved, as if time had been kept from it by design. Holmes held it near the lamp and began to read. He did not read aloud at first. His eyes moved across the lines with a speed that suggested comfort, and then, abruptly, slowed. Watson saw the moment the meaning caught him, not like a blow, but like a hand closing around the throat. Holmes drew a breath and, without looking up, read the first lines aloud in a low, steady voice. Watson could not have later recalled the exact phrasing, only the sensation of it, how the words seemed to alter the air in the room, making the warmth of the fire feel suddenly insufficient. Harrow went paler. His hands trembled despite the effort to keep them still. Holmes paused mid-sentence, eyes fixed on the page. A faint silence opened in the room, wide and uncanny. Outside, the rain kept falling as if nothing had changed. Yet inside 221B, everything had. Watson watched Holmes's face, searching for a sign of disbelief, amusement, dismissal, anything that would restore the ordinary rules of cause and effect. He found none. Holmes lowered the page slightly. This is not a prank, he said. Harrow's voice cracked. No. Holmes read again, this time more carefully, and Watson understood why Harrow had used the word unmake. The letter did not merely accuse. It spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had already walked the path Holmes now stood at the entrance of. It was a warning written like a map, and a confession written like a trap. Holmes set the page down on the table, fingertips still resting on it as if reluctant to release contact. He looked at Harrow. "You said it was sealed," Holmes said. "It was," Harrow insisted. "It is. It should have been." "And yet someone has opened it," Holmes replied, "and they have taken the trouble to send it to me with a future date, an official stamp, and a resealed wax impression. That is not the work of a careless thief. That is a message." Harrow's eyes darted. "Then you must return it. You must not pursue it. Mr. Holmes, you do not understand what sits behind that letter. There are men." Holmes lifted his hand, and Harrow's words died as if cut. "I understand enough," Holmes said. "Someone has decided that an archive may be used as a weapon, and they have chosen me as the hand that will fire it. That alone is reason to pursue it, but there is more." His gaze drifted briefly to Watson, and something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement perhaps of the personal sting in the phrase "someone you once spared." Watson felt it too, the quiet dread of old cases returning in altered shape, like familiar streets seen at night. Holmes drew the envelope closer again, turning it with methodical care. He examined the inside edge of the flap. He ran a fingernail along the seam as if reading a hidden text in the paper fibers. "What are you doing?" Harrow asked, voice thin. "Listening," Holmes said. To paper, Harrow's attempt at skepticism failed. It sounded like pleading. Holmes did not answer immediately. He slid 2 fingers into the envelope, deeper than before, and stopped. His eyes narrowed. Watson leaned in. "What is it?" Holmes's fingers moved with delicate certainty, and he drew out something that had been concealed in the inner fold. Something pressed flat against the paper, so it would not be noticed unless one searched for it. A second seal. Smaller than the first, tucked away like a secret within a secret. The wax was darker, older in hue, and it bore a symbol impressed so plainly that it seemed to have been stamped yesterday. Holmes held it to the lamplight. Watson felt his breath catch, not because he recognized it, but because Holmes's face changed, only slightly but unmistakably. The calm intellect remained, yet beneath it something colder stirred, something that remembered. Harrow took a step back, as if the symbol itself radiated danger. Holmes's voice was very soft when he spoke. "This mark," he said, "belongs to only one man in London bold enough to use it." Watson searched Holmes's eyes. "Who?" Holmes did not look away from the seal. "A man," he said, "who is already supposed to be dead." A man already supposed to be dead. Those words did not fall neatly to the floor and stay there. They hung in the warm air of 221B like a thin strand of smoke that refused to disperse, threading itself through every quiet movement that followed. Holmes held the smaller seal to the lamplight once more, not to admire it, but to confirm that his eyes were not indulging some private superstition. Harrow stood with his back half turned to the door, as though the stairwell might suddenly produce its own answer. His gaze kept flinching away from the wax symbol, returning only in brief, pained glances, the way one might look at a name carved on a gravestone. Watson watched Holmes's face. He had seen that calm hundreds of times, calm in the presence of danger, calm in the presence of violence, calm even at the edge of tragedy. Yet there was a difference now, a subtle alteration in the set of his mouth and the stillness of his eyes. It was not fear, it was recognition. Something old and unwanted had been called back by that seal, and the room had become, in a way that was difficult to describe, less like a home and more like a threshold. "You know the mark," Watson said. Holmes did not answer immediately. He slid the smaller seal back into the envelope, not sealing it again, but tucking it away as one hides a blade. Then he folded the letter itself with careful precision and slipped it into his inner pocket. The motion was measured, almost gentle, but Watson could not miss what it meant. Holmes was not going to return it or forget it. He was taking ownership of it. Harrow's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and the way he shaped the words held both appeal and warning. "If you insist on pursuing this, you must understand what the repository is. It is not a library. It is not a museum. It is a lock." Holmes lifted his eyes. "Then we shall bring a key." Harrow swallowed. "There are keys," he said, "but they do not open for one signature." "3," Holmes replied, as if reciting something long known. Harrow blinked, startled. "Yes." Holmes's gaze flicked briefly to Harrow's hands, to the thin ring of metal visible beneath his coat cuff where a keychain rested against his wrist. "You carry them as a man carries responsibility," Holmes said, "not as a man carries power." Harrow's shoulders tightened. "I carry them because I must." "And you came here because you could not carry this alone," Holmes said quietly. Watson saw Harrow's eyes shine with a quick, humiliating moisture that he tried to blink away. It was not the wetness of sentiment. It was the wetness of a man realizing, too late, the size of the thing in his care. Holmes turned toward the window. The street below was a smear of gaslight and rain. A cab passed, wheels whispering along the wet stones, the driver hunched against the weather. London continued its nightly business with indifference, as if sealed letters and impossible dates were mere private problems. Holmes reached for his coat. "We go now." Harrow's mouth fell slightly open. "Now?" "Whoever sent that letter has already acted," Holmes said, pulling the collar up, his movements brisk and final. "They have opened a seal meant to remain intact. They have delivered it here as though time itself were their servant. If we allow them the rest of the night, they will not waste it." Watson stood and reached for his own coat without thinking. The familiar sensation returned, the pull of investigation, the sharpening of the senses, the quiet dread that lives beneath excitement when one knows, with a kind of certainty, that the case will not be tidy. Mrs. Hudson, summoned by the earlier commotion, appeared at the door with a candle and a worried look. Holmes gave her a brief reassurance that was more courtesy than comfort. Within minutes they were on the stair, descending into the smell of damp stone and the lingering scent of coal smoke from the building's lower floors. Outside, the rain struck Watson's face like cold fingers. The air tasted of soot and wet brick. A hansom cab waited near the curb. Holmes had whistled once, and it had appeared with the prompt obedience of a city trained to serve the urgent. Harrow climbed in first, as if he feared being seen with them in the open street. Watson followed, then Holmes, who gave the address to the driver in a low voice that left no room for misunderstanding. As the cab rolled forward, Watson watched Harrow in the dim interior. He sat rigidly, hands clasped in his lap, eyes fixed on the blurred lights outside. He looked less like a man going to work and more like a man being escorted to a confession. "You said the letter was catalogued," Watson began carefully. "If you haven't read it, how do you know what it contains?" Harrow's jaw tightened. "The repository keeps summaries," he said. "Not of everything, but of certain things, those too dangerous to leave without context, even behind locks. In some collections we maintain an index written in code, so that even if someone sees a line, they cannot understand it without the key." Holmes's gaze remained on the dark window, but his attention was clearly fixed on every syllable. "And the line you saw," Holmes said, "was enough." Harrow's hands twitched. "It was enough to know that it should never be moved," he said, "and enough to know that if it was moved deliberately." The cab turned, the wheels sliding slightly on the slick stones. Watson felt the city shift around them. Narrower streets, fewer shops, more official buildings hunched in darkness like silent sentries. There were fewer pedestrians here, and those who did appear kept their heads down, collars up, moving quickly as if the rain itself were an authority. The Crown Repository did not announce itself with grandeur. It sat behind a high iron gate, its facade severe, windows narrow, stonework darkened by years of soot and weather. It looked less like a place of knowledge and more like a place built to withstand siege. The cab halted. Holmes stepped out first, boots meeting the wet pavement with quiet confidence. Watson followed, then Harrow, who paused a moment under the gate's shadow as if gathering courage. He produced a key from his ring and fitted it to the outer lock. The gate opened with a sound that was not quite a creak and not quite a groan, more like the reluctant breath of a thing disturbed. Inside, the courtyard smelled of cold stone and old iron. Their footsteps sounded too loud. Even the rain seemed to fall more quietly here, dampened by the high walls. Harrow led them to a side entrance rather than the main doors, as though the building's front face was reserved for official hours and official lies. He unlocked another door, then another. Each lock had its own feel and sound. Each click seemed to tighten the air. When they finally stepped inside, the warmth of 221B felt suddenly far away. The repository's interior was cool and dry, the air conditioned not by machine but by the very nature of the stone and the records it protected. The smell was distinct, paper aged into a faint sweetness, dust that had been settled for years, and something sharper, ink perhaps, or the metallic trace of old sealing wax. They moved through a corridor lit only by wall sconces. The gaslight was lower here, as if even flame were expected to behave. Shadows clung to corners and doorways. The sound of their footsteps repeated behind them in a dull echo that made Watson instinctively glance back. "This is after hours," Watson murmured, more statement than question. Harrow nodded. "Officially, no one enters," he said. "Unofficially, people enter when they must." Holmes's eyes drifted over the doorframes, the locks, the small brass plates with coded designations. "And when they shouldn't," he added. Harrow's silence was answer enough. They reached a desk set into a recessed alcove. Behind it sat a man in uniform, shoulders squared, face composed, hands resting on a ledger as though the book itself were a weapon. He looked up slowly, his gaze sharpening when he saw Harrow, sharpening further when he saw Holmes. "Mr. Harrow," the man said, voice clipped. "Sergeant," Harrow replied with forced steadiness. "I need access to the sealed corridor." The sergeant's eyes flicked to Watson, then returned to Holmes with a careful, assessing stare. "At this hour." Harrow lifted his chin. "At this hour." The sergeant did not move. "The rule stands." Harrow's fingers tightened on his keyring. "I have my signature." "Two more," the sergeant said, and the words landed like iron. Holmes stepped forward. "You are correct," he said mildly. 3 signatures." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "An interested party," Holmes replied. The sergeant's gaze held him for a moment, then shifted to Harrow again, as if deciding how much trouble this was worth. "Even with 3 signatures, there is procedure," he said. Holmes's mouth twitched, just faintly. Procedure is a comfort to those who wish the world to remain predictable. The sergeant's expression did not soften. Procedure is the only reason this building still stands. Harrow drew a breath, steadying himself. "We will obtain the other signatures," he said. "Please inform the duty officer." The sergeant's eyes flicked again to Holmes, and for an instant Watson sensed something like reluctance. Perhaps the man recognized the name without being told. Perhaps he simply understood what kind of trouble walked with that posture and those eyes. He rose, moved to a speaking tube, and murmured into it with the restrained tone of a man who dislikes becoming involved. They waited. In the waiting, Watson became aware of the repository's particular silence. It was not the pleasant hush of a library where people have chosen quiet. It was enforced. It pressed down. It made even breath feel like an imposition. Footsteps approached from deeper within. A door opened. A man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, with the stiff bearing of the police. His coat was damp at the edges, suggesting he had come from outside recently. A heavy jaw, sharp eyes, and that unmistakable air of authority that expects obedience as a default. Inspector Gideon Pike. Watson had seen him once or twice in official contexts, though never closely. He was not a man given to friendliness. He looked at Holmes as if looking at a tool he did not entirely trust. "Mr. Holmes," Pike said. Holmes inclined his head. "Inspector." Pike's gaze slid to Harrow, then back. "You've chosen an interesting hour to visit government property." Holmes's tone remained calm. "Government property has chosen an interesting hour to visit me." Pike's mouth tightened. "So I've been told." Harrow's voice came out a shade too eager. "Inspector, thank you for coming. We require access to a sealed collection." Pike's eyes narrowed. "You require it," he echoed, as if tasting the word. Holmes let the silence stretch a fraction, then spoke. "A letter from within your repository has been delivered to my rooms," he said. "It was meant to be sealed. It bears an official stamp and an impossible date, and it carries a mark, one you may recognize." Pike's gaze sharpened. "What mark?" Holmes did not produce it yet. "A seal associated with a man believed dead," he said. Watson saw the flicker in Pike's eyes, the smallest disturbance. It was not surprise exactly. It was the reaction of a man who has heard a name mentioned that ought never to be spoken in certain rooms. Pike's voice stayed controlled. "If you've come to make jokes about ghosts, you've come to the wrong building." Holmes's reply was soft. "If I wanted to make jokes, Inspector, I would have stayed by my fire." Pike held Holmes's gaze for a moment longer, then looked at Harrow. "This is irregular," he said. "If the repository has been compromised, we handle it through channels." Harrow's composure cracked slightly. "The channels may be the compromise," he said before he could stop himself. Then he flushed, as if realizing what he had admitted. Pike's eyes went hard. "Careful, Mr. Harrow." Holmes stepped in smoothly, not allowing the tension to become a rupture. "We are not here to embarrass your office," he said. "We are here because someone has already acted outside the channels. Our response must be faster than their next move." Pike's jaw worked. Watson sensed the internal battle, duty against instinct, pride against the uncomfortable awareness that Holmes was often right. At last Pike exhaled through his nose. "You will have supervision," he said. "Mine." Holmes inclined his head again. "I would expect nothing less." One signature secured, two remained. Harrow led them deeper into the building, past more locked doors, down a corridor that grew narrower, the stone closer. Here the gaslight seemed dimmer, the air cooler. They reached a small office where a woman stood at a table strewn with papers. She was not young but not old, somewhere in that sharp age where experience has cut away softness. Her hair was pinned back severely. Her sleeves were rolled, and her hands moved with the efficient certainty of someone accustomed to handling fragile things without sentiment. She looked up, and her gaze was immediate and exacting. "Dr. Livia Sorrel." Watson recognized the name more than the face. A historian of some repute, known for precision bordering on obsession. A woman who had built her life on the careful arrangement of facts, as if facts could be used to rebuild what the world had broken. Her eyes moved over them quickly, Harrow with a faint note of impatience, Pike with wary respect, Watson with brief professional recognition, and Holmes with something else. Not admiration, not hostility, something tighter, a familiarity she did not want to admit. "Mr. Harrow," she said, voice controlled, "you said this could wait until morning." Harrow's shoulders stiffened. "It cannot." Sorrel's gaze flicked to Holmes. "And you have brought him." Holmes's tone was mild. Dr. Sorrel. Her eyes narrowed. Do not pretend you know me. Holmes's face remained composed, but Watson felt the subtle shift again, that almost invisible sign that Holmes had noticed more than he would yet say. We have not met, Holmes replied, but your handwriting has addressed 3 petitions to the repository board in the past year. The 4th was rejected last week. You became impatient. Sorrel's lips pressed together. That is none of your business. It becomes my business when sealed things begin walking out of locked collections, Holmes said. Sorrel's gaze sharpened. What sealed thing? Harrow, voice strained, answered, a letter from the Ashdown Holdings. At the name, Sorrel's fingers stopped moving. For a fraction of a second, her face went blank, as if the muscles had forgotten what expression to wear. Then she recovered too quickly. The Ashdown box is restricted, she said, even to staff, especially at night. Pike stepped forward. We're not here to ask your permission to do nothing, he said. We're here to prevent a breach becoming a scandal. Sorrel's eyes flicked to him. A scandal, she echoed softly, and there was something bitter beneath the word. Holmes watched her closely. Watson could see the way Sorrel's gaze kept returning to Harrow's keyring, the way her shoulders held themselves as if braced against a blow. Whatever Ashdown contained, it was not merely political history to her, it was personal. Harrow's voice wavered. We need access, he said. Your signature as historical supervisor. Sorrel hesitated. In that hesitation, Watson saw the emotional engine begin to tighten, each of them standing at the edge of something that would not simply be solved, but uncovered, like rot beneath polished wood. Sorrel's eyes met Holmes's. You will not make this theatrical, she said quietly. You will not treat it like a parlor trick. Holmes's tone softened a fraction. I have no interest in theatre tonight, Doctor, only in what someone has gone to great lengths to keep hidden. Sorrel's gaze held him, searching for mockery, for arrogance, for the careless thrill of a hunter. She found none. At last she reached for a pen. 1 hour, she said, and if you touch anything outside the collection, I will have you removed. Pike's mouth tightened. You will not have anything, he said, but he did not stop her. She signed. 2 signatures secured, 1 remained. They moved again, deeper still, down a stairwell where the walls sweated faintly with cold. At the bottom, Harrow paused before a heavy door with a brass plate engraved in code. He fitted a key, turned it slowly, then pressed his palm flat against the wood as if it might resist. The door opened, and the air beyond was different, drier, older, carrying that particular scent of long-kept paper. The corridor beyond was lit by candles in glass housings, their flames steady, protected from drafts. The light they threw was warm, but it did not comfort. It merely revealed. Harrow spoke in a low voice. This corridor is sealed, he said. Even the cleaning staff do not enter. Every movement is logged. Holmes glanced at the candle housings, and yet someone moved without leaving a record. Harrow flinched at the implication, but said nothing. They approached a metal gate inside the corridor, another barrier, another stage of separation. Here Harrow produced not a simple key but a small iron token, fitted it into a slot, then turned a second key. The mechanism clicked twice, then released with a heavy sound. This is where the 3rd signature comes, Harrow murmured. Watson looked around. Who holds it? Harrow's face tightened. A former clerk, he said. Margaret Vale. Sorrel's eyes narrowed slightly. She should not have it, she said. Harrow's voice carried a note of defensiveness. She earned it, he said. She served as code clerk when the Ashdown box was sealed. The board insisted a witness to the seal remain alive and accountable. She became difficult, but the key remained with her. Pike made a small sound of disapproval. A civilian holds access to a sealed political collection, he said. That is madness. It is tradition, Harrow replied, and there was desperation in it, as if tradition were the only shield he had left. Holmes's gaze was distant. Tradition is merely an old excuse, he murmured, but it will serve us for now. Margaret Vale was not found in a clerk's office. She was found in a small room near the sealed stacks, a room that looked less like a workspace and more like a refuge. A kettle sat cold on a small stove. A chair faced a narrow table, and on that table was a worn ledger and a small tin box. There were no decorative items, no comfort, only objects chosen for function. Vale stood when they entered, and Watson understood at once why Harrow had described her as difficult. She was a woman perhaps in her 40s, hair greying prematurely, eyes sharp with suspicion. Her clothes were plain but clean, as if she maintained order in the one realm she could still control. Her gaze moved over them quickly, then settled on Holmes with immediate dislike. "So," she said, "they sent for you." Harrow's voice was cautious. "Margaret, we need." "I know what you need," Vale cut in. Her voice was low, steady, and carried the hard edge of someone who has spent too long being spoken about rather than spoken to. "You need the Ashdown box. You need to pretend you didn't already decide you'd take it." Sorrel's jaw tightened. "This is not your stage, Vale." Vale's eyes flicked to her. "And yet you keep coming to watch," she replied, and there was a flash of old resentment there, quick and sharp. Pike stepped forward. "Miss Vale," he said, choosing the title that sounded most respectful. "This is an official matter." Vale's eyes moved to his coat, his stance, his authority. She did not seem impressed. "Everything in this building is official," she said. "That is how you hide rot." Watson felt the tension deepen. The intellectual engine was moving, locks, signatures, coded ledgers, but beneath it, the emotional engine was gathering pressure in the faces, the pauses, the long-held grudges. Holmes spoke at last, his tone quiet enough to draw attention without force. "Miss Vale," he said, "a letter from the Ashdown collection has left this building. It was delivered to my rooms tonight." Vale's eyes sharpened. "A letter," she repeated. Holmes held her gaze. "Do you deny it?" Vale's lips pressed together. "No," she said after a moment. "I deny nothing. I simply know what happens when you open sealed things." Harrow's voice trembled. "We must see what else has been disturbed." Vale's eyes went to him, and for a moment Watson saw something like pity. "You are a good man in a bad place," she said softly. Then her expression hardened again. "But you are too late. Whatever walked out of here did so because someone wanted it to." Holmes's gaze did not leave her. "Then we must learn who wanted it," he said, "and why." Vale's fingers moved toward the tin box on her table, then stopped, as though she were restraining herself from touching it in front of witnesses. "Do you know what the Ashdown box is?" she asked, and the question was not directed solely at Holmes. It was directed at all of them like a challenge. Sorrel answered quickly. "A sealed political collection," she said. "Blackmail records, correspondence, evidence." Vale's mouth twisted. "Evidence," she echoed. "That is a polite word." Pike's voice was stern. "Miss Vale, if you have knowledge relevant to a breach." Vale raised a hand, not dismissive but weary. "Everyone who matters already knows," she said. "They just pretend they don't. That's the game." Holmes's voice was softer now, almost gentle. "You were a code clerk," he said. "You would know if something was logged as destroyed." Vale's eyes flicked to him. "I would," she said. Holmes waited, letting silence work. Vale's gaze moved to Harrow, then to Sorrel, then to Pike. Finally, she exhaled, as though giving in not to them, but to inevitability. She took a key from a chain around her neck, held it up so the candlelight caught it. "This is the third signature," she said. It opens the final gate. But understand me, Mr. Holmes, I do not do this because I trust you. Holmes inclined his head. Then why? Vale's eyes were steady. Because someone is moving in the dark, she said, and the dark does not care who it ruins. She rose and moved past them with brisk efficiency. Harrow looked both relieved and ashamed, as though grateful for her help yet strung by her accusation. Together they returned to the inner gate. Vale fitted her key into the third lock. The mechanism resisted for a moment, then surrendered with a heavy click that sounded, to Watson's ears, like a door in a mind opening after years of refusal. The sealed stacks beyond were arranged in long, narrow aisles. Metal shelves rose high, lined with boxes of uniform size and color, each marked with coded labels. Candles in glass housings sat at intervals, their light trembling slightly as the group moved, casting tall, shifting shadows that made the boxes seem like silent witnesses. Holmes moved through the aisles with careful attention, not touching, not rushing. He paused at corners, listening. Watson realized the habit Holmes was mapping, not the location of boxes, but the rhythm of the place, the ways a person might move, where a footstep would sound, where a candle flame might reveal a draft from a door opened briefly and shut again. Harrow led them to a particular shelf and pointed. "Ashdown," he said quietly. The box itself was unremarkable, sturdy, sealed with a thin wire and wax impression. Yet even before Holmes touched it, Watson felt something tighten in his chest. It was not the box. It was the air around it, the sense that this small rectangle of paper and string held the power to shake lives. Vale stepped forward and examined the seal. Her fingers hovered near it, not touching. "It has been resealed," she said, voice flat. Harrow's face drained. "No." Vale's gaze stayed on the wax. "Yes," she said, "the wire is slightly misaligned. The wax impression is too clean at the edge. Someone warmed it." Watson felt a chill, another warmed seal, another careful hand. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He did not break the seal at once. Instead, he examined it the way he had examined the letter's wax, reading surface imperfections like testimony. His long finger traced the wire's path. He glanced at the shelf. "This shelf has been dusted recently," he murmured. Harrow frowned. "That is impossible. No one dusts sealed stacks." Holmes pointed to a faint smear on the metal. "Someone brushed their sleeve against it," he said. "The dust is disturbed in one line, not the careful clearing of maintenance, a single, hurried movement." Pike shifted, uneasy. "So someone was here," he said. Holmes's gaze flicked to the candles. "Not long ago," he replied. "The wax has not fully regained the hardness of years. It is not fresh, but it is not old. 2, perhaps 3 days." Harrow's breath caught. "That aligns," he whispered, almost to himself. "Aligns with what?" Watson asked. Harrow's eyes darted, then dropped. "With the incident," he said, "the predecessor." Sorrel's gaze sharpened. "What predecessor?" Harrow hesitated. Pike answered, voice clipped. "Harrow's predecessor in this section, found dead 2 nights ago." Watson's stomach tightened. "Dead?" Harrow's voice was strained. "They said it was an accident," he said quickly. "A fall, a misstep on the stair, but there was no examination, no proper inquiry. They filed it and moved on." Holmes's eyes remained on the box. "Because examination invites questions," he said softly, "and questions invite answers." Vale's face had gone still. "His name was Thomas Rook," she said quietly. "He was careful, he would not misstep." Harrow's voice cracked. "I tried to insist," he said, "but they told me." "They told you to remember your place," Vale finished, and there was bitter familiarity in it. Holmes finally moved to break the seal. He did so with the same surgical care, snapping the wire without jerking, lifting the wax piece intact. He opened the box and slid out the top file. Inside were folders, each labeled in that same restrained, official script. Holmes did not rifle through them like a man hungry for secrets. He lifted one, opened it, scanned quickly, then set it aside with controlled precision. Watson watched him, waiting for the moment the case would shift from atmosphere into substance. Holmes paused at a thin ledger tucked between files. The cover was plain, the edges worn, but the ink on its spine was crisp. He opened it carefully, and the pages whispered under his fingers. "This," Holmes said, "is the spine of the matter." Harrow stepped closer, anxiety tightening his voice. "The access ledger," he murmured. "Every movement is recorded." Holmes's eyes moved down the columns. Dates, times, signatures, box identifiers. The entries were neat, consistent, a rhythm of bureaucracy. Then Holmes stopped. Watson leaned in. The line Holmes's finger rested upon was written in a slightly different hand, subtle but there, and beside the box identifier was a note. "Logged as destroyed." Watson felt the absurdity hit him first. "Destroyed," he murmured, "but the box is here." Holmes's finger moved to the next line. A new entry, a week old, written under a Clark number Watson did not recognize. The handwriting was controlled, too controlled, as though someone had practiced imitating the official hand. The box identifier matched. The note suggested recataloguing, an administrative adjustment. Holmes's voice was quiet. "It was logged as destroyed," he said, "and yet it was reintroduced." Harrow's face had gone slack with shock. "That cannot happen," he whispered. "If something is destroyed, it is removed from the system entirely. There is no record to recatalogue." Holmes's gaze did not lift. "Unless someone kept it," he said, and waited. Sorrell's voice was tight. "Waited for what?" Holmes closed the ledger gently. "For the moment when the past becomes useful," he said. Watson felt the weight of it. This building meant to seal history, now being used as a machine to release it at precisely the right time. The intellectual engine clicked forward. Someone with access, someone with patience, someone capable of warming seals and forging ledger lines. But the emotional engine pressed in too. Watson glanced at Holmes and saw again that subtle tension in him, not the tension of danger, the tension of memory. "You recognize something," Watson said quietly, not in accusation but in concern. Holmes's eyes flicked to him for a fraction of a second, and in that glance Watson sensed the truth. Holmes was unsettled, but not by the thought of a blackmail ring or a dead archivist. He was unsettled by what the letter had hinted, that this case touched an earlier choice, an act of mercy perhaps, offered in a moment when Holmes believed he was doing right. Mercy is a dangerous word in an archive. The thought returned like a cold draft. Pike cleared his throat. "This ledger proves tampering," he said. "It proves someone accessed the collection under a false number. We take this to the commissioner." Holmes's gaze was steady. "And by the time the commissioner raids it, the person who wrote that false number will be lighting his fire with your paperwork," he said. Pike's jaw tightened. "You don't trust the police." Holmes's voice was calm. "I trust individuals. Systems are slower." Vale's eyes stayed on the box. "The quiet man," she said suddenly. Watson looked at her. "The quiet man." Vale's mouth was thin. "That is what they called the witness," she said. "The one who supplied the names, the one who made the blackmail ring possible." Sorrell's voice sharpened with something personal. "A myth," she said. "A convenient story." Vale's eyes cut to her. "Not a myth," she replied. "A mask." Holmes's gaze lifted slightly. And masks, he murmured, are always worn by someone. Harrow's voice was strained. The quiet man vanished, he said. No one knows who he was. The files were sealed precisely to prevent the public from hunting. Holmes's tone remained quiet, or to prevent the wrong people from being hunted, he said. Watson's attention returned to the box. Holmes continued moving through its contents, not reading everything but selecting. A clipped note here, a list of initials there, a folded sheet with a seal pressed hard enough to leave a bruise on the paper. Each piece was a fragment of something larger, and Holmes was assembling it in his mind with invisible speed. Then his hand paused. He drew out a photograph. It was older than the paper around it, the edges slightly curled, the surface worn in a way that suggested it had been handled, perhaps often, perhaps in secret. The image showed a young man in formal attire, seated stiffly, eyes fixed forward. There was no smile, only that rigid, controlled posture of someone aware that a camera captures more than appearance. Watson felt a strange sensation in his chest, the way one feels when a room suddenly smells like a forgotten place. The young man's eyes were not identical to Watson's, yet they were familiar, not in shape but in expression, the same steady gaze, the same refusal to betray emotion. Holmes studied the photograph without speaking. Then, slowly, he turned it so Watson could see the label written beneath the image in careful script. Watson's surname. He stared at it, and for a moment the archive corridor, the candles, the locked doors, all of it receded. The name on the label felt like a hand reaching out of the past and gripping him by the collar. Holmes's voice was very soft. "Dr. Watson," he said, "tell me, who in your family would have reason to be buried in a sealed political archive?" And as Watson's breath caught in his throat, the photograph seemed to darken in the candlelight, as if the young man in it had been waiting all along for someone to finally look him in the eyes. The photograph with Watson's surname did not feel like a clue so much as a hand closing around the back of his neck, and Holmes's quiet question, "Who in your family would have reason to be buried in a sealed political archive?" followed them out of the candle-lit stacks as surely as their footsteps echoed down the corridor. They left the ashdown shelves behind with the strange sensation of having trespassed not only against rules, but against time. Harrow locked the gates again with fingers that fumbled once, then steadied, as though he feared the metal might remember his hesitation. Vale's key returned to its chain with a small, hard click that sounded like refusal. Dr. Sorrel walked with her chin lifted, her gaze fixed forward, the posture of a woman who would rather blade than appear uncertain. Inspector Pike remained half a pace behind Holmes, close enough to watch, not close enough to admit he was following. Watson carried the photograph in his mind like a weight, but he did not ask to see it again. He feared, absurdly, that if he stared too long, he might recognize something he had spent a lifetime not looking for. Holmes said little until they reached the repository's outer corridor. Even there he did not speak of the young man's eyes, nor of the label. He watched the others. He watched what they touched, what they avoided touching, how their shoulders shifted when certain doors closed. He watched Harrow's glance toward the ledger alcove, and Vale's split-second pause at the stairwell, as though the memory of Thomas Rook's accident lived in the stone. Pike broke the silence first. "You will not remove any documents," he said to Holmes, voice clipped, official. Holmes's reply was mild. "I have removed nothing," he said. "Not yet." Pike's jaw tightened. "I mean it, Holmes." Holmes looked at him at last. "You mean stability," he said softly. "You mean a world where no one has to answer for old sins." Pike's eyes flashed. "I mean the law." Holmes's gaze held him, calm and unyielding. "The law is a net," he said. "It catches what falls into it. It does not always catch what swims beneath." Watson saw Pike's hand twitch near his coat pocket, as if reaching for a cigarette or a restraint. He did neither. Instead, he turned his attention to Harrow. "Your predecessor," Pike said, "this Thomas Rook, you will give me every detail you have, tonight." Harrow's voice came out thin. "There isn't much," he said. "They said he slipped. They filed it quickly. There was pressure." "From whom?" Pike demanded. Harrow's eyes darted to Sorrel, then away. "From above," he said, and the phrase sounded like a man pointing upward because he cannot bear to point at a face. Sorrel's voice cut in, precise and sharp. "If you intend to conduct your inquiry here, Inspector, do it without theatrics. This building does not belong to your pride." Pike's gaze snapped to her. "And it does not belong to your obsessions, Doctor." Sorrel's lips thinned. "My obsession is truth," she said. "Yours is order." Vale gave a small, humorless sound. "Truth and order," she murmured. "Neither of you will have both." Holmes watched them all with that quiet attention that made even their sharp words feel like evidence. Watson realized, uneasily, that Holmes was no longer merely chasing the stolen letter. He was mapping a human terrain: fear, shame, ambition, and the particular kind of loyalty that grows where secrets rot. They stepped out into the courtyard again, and the rain met them like a cold verdict. The iron gate clanged behind them, shutting the repository's silence away. Yet Watson felt, perversely, that the silence had come with them. A cab was hailed. They climbed in, coats damp, breath faintly visible in the confined interior. It was only when Baker Street's gaslights blurred into view again that Watson spoke, his voice quiet but edged with something he did not often allow Holmes to hear. "That name," Watson said, "my surname under that photograph. You cannot expect me to treat it as merely another line in a ledger." Holmes did not look at him at first. He watched the street, the passing shapes, the rain. "I do not expect you to treat anything as merely," he said. Watson's fingers tightened around the handle of his umbrella. "Then tell me what you think it means." Holmes's face remained composed. "It means someone wants you unsettled," he said. "That is not an answer," Watson replied, and the edge in his voice surprised him. It surprised Holmes too, though Holmes disguised the reaction quickly. "It is the first answer," Holmes said, "and it is the safest." Watson leaned forward, the cab rocking slightly beneath them. "Holmes," he said, and his tone was lower now, less controlled. "Who is that man, or who do you believe he is? If you know something, if you recognize something, do not wrap it in cleverness and leave me to unravel my own name in the dark." Holmes turned his head at last. In the dim light, Watson saw the faint shadow under Holmes's cheekbone, the reflective gleam in his eyes. He looked older for a moment, not in years but in burdens. "I recognize the kind of photograph," Holmes said quietly. "The posture, the way the hands are held. It is the sort taken when a man has been instructed to sit still and appear respectable. It is used in records meant for officials, not families." Watson swallowed. "So you think he was official?" "No," Holmes said, and the word came out firm. "I think he was used." Watson's pulse quickened. "Used by whom?" Holmes's gaze drifted away again, back to the rain-streaked window. "By someone who understood that a name can be both shield and chain," he said. Watson felt anger rise, not hot but cold, the anger of a man who has bled for another and is now being kept at arm's length. "You are fencing," he said. Holmes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I am sparing you," he replied. The words landed poorly. Watson stared at him. "Sparing me," he echoed, and a humorless laugh escaped him. "Do you hear yourself? As if this is your decision to make." Holmes's eyes flashed. "It is my decision to prevent you from walking into a pit because you are furious that I won't hand you a lantern." Watson's voice hardened. "I am not furious because you won't hand me a lantern," he said. "I am furious because you are holding the lantern behind your back, while my family name is being dragged into an archive like a corpse. For a beat, the only sound was the cab's wheels on wet stone. Harrow sat opposite them, silent, eyes wide, clearly wishing he could melt into the upholstery. The driver's silhouette shifted once, as if sensing the tension. Holmes exhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice had lost its edge, becoming the calm of someone forcing himself back into control. "You want honesty," Holmes said. "Very well. The photograph means someone has done their homework. They have found a thread in your past, perhaps not even something you know, and they have placed it in the Ashdown box to ensure this case will not remain abstract. They want you emotionally compromised." Watson's breath came shallow. "And you," he said quietly, "are you compromised too?" Holmes's eyes did not leave the window. "Yes," he said, as if the word cost him nothing, "but not in the way you imagine." Watson stared at his profile. "In what way, then?" Holmes's fingers tapped once against his knee, an involuntary motion, small like a muscle remembering a former habit. "This case," he said softly, "touches an older decision, a mercy I once offered, a mercy that may have bred something poisonous." Watson felt the chill of it. Holmes spoke of mercy rarely. When he did, it was usually with restraint, as though he distrusted his own capacity for it. The cab slowed near 221B. They climbed out into Baker Street's damp, the familiar doorway waiting like a refuge that suddenly felt less secure. Mrs. Hudson let them in with a worried look, then retreated, sensing by instinct that questions would not be welcomed. Upstairs, the sitting room greeted them with the smell of old tobacco and cooling fire. The lamp still glowed, soft and domestic, but the room felt altered, as though the letter's impossible date had shifted the furniture by an inch in the mind. Holmes removed the sealed letter from his inner pocket and placed it on the table with quiet care. Watson watched it the way one watches a loaded firearm. Harrow stood near the door, coat still dripping faintly. He looked uncertain whether he was allowed to sit, uncertain whether he was allowed to leave. He had the bearing of a man who has just realized he is in the middle of something far larger than his job title. Pike did not come inside. He had left them at the door with a final look that promised presence even in absence. "I'll have a man watching the street," he had said. "Don't do anything foolish." Holmes's response had been almost kind. "Inspector," he had said, "if you knew what foolish looked like, you would be in a different profession." Now, with Pike gone, the room seemed to exhale, only to tighten again as Holmes began to work. He did not leap into dramatic declarations. He did not announce his theories. He moved through the night's evidence with a surgeon's focus. The letter on the table, the smaller internal seal, the edges of the envelope, the scent of warmed wax. He laid out a fresh sheet of paper beside it and wrote a short list, names, times, places, then crossed out one name, then wrote it again, as though the act of recording it forced his mind to take it seriously. Watson watched him for a while, then forced himself to speak, voice quieter now, with the anger cooled into something more dangerous: determination. "I will not be managed," Watson said. "Not in this. If that photograph is a hook it has caught, I want to know what I am being dragged toward." Holmes's eyes lifted briefly. "Then we will proceed with precision," he said, "not with panic." Watson's jaw tightened. "And what about Harrow?" he asked, glancing at the archivist. "Is he friend, witness, or suspect?" Harrow flinched. "I didn't take it," he said quickly. Holmes's gaze settled on Harrow. "I did not accuse you," he said, "but you have answered as a man who fears accusation. Tell me, Mr. Harrow, when did you last handle the Ashdown ledger?" Harrow's mouth opened, then closed. I oversee," he began. Holmes's voice remained calm. "That is not an answer." Harrow swallowed. "This morning," he admitted, "after I learned of the discrepancy, I went to verify the entries." Holmes nodded slightly, as though confirming what he already knew. And you carried the keyring with you, Holmes said, to show authority. Harrow's fingers twitched toward his coat pocket. Yes. Holmes's eyes flicked to Harrow's right hand. You are right-handed, he said. Harrow blinked, yes. Holmes's tone was mild. Then you would have held the ledger open with your left hand while writing with your right. The ledger is large, awkward. You would have pressed your left index finger near the inner margin to keep the page flat. Harrow stared unsettled. Perhaps. Holmes rose, crossed to the table, and lifted the envelope by its edge. He held it toward Harrow without touching Harrow, like a man offering a specimen. Show me your left index finger, Holmes said. Harrow hesitated, then held out his hand. Watson saw it at once, a thin line near the pad of the finger, a small paper cut, half-healed, the kind gained not from a knife, but from the sharp edge of a page. Harrow's face flushed. It's nothing, he said, voice too fast. Paper. Holmes's gaze remained steady. It is something, he said. Not proof of theft, but proof of access. Proof you were indeed with the ledger. Harrow's eyes darted to Watson as if seeking an ally, then away. Of course I was, he insisted. I told you. Holmes did not press further. He turned slightly, his attention shifting like a blade changing direction. Now, he said, tell me about the courier. Harrow licked his lips. I didn't hire him, he said. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Did you see him before he arrived at my door? Harrow hesitated. That hesitation was small, but in Holmes's presence it might as well have been shouted. I saw a man, Harrow admitted, in the outer hallway of the repository this morning. Not staff, he wore a messenger cap, I assumed. His voice faltered. I assumed he had been hired by the board to collect something. I asked no questions. Watson felt the sting of it. You assumed, he repeated. Harrow's eyes dropped. We assume to survive there, he said quietly. If you question every irregularity, you make enemies. Holmes nodded once, not in approval, but in understanding. Fear creates habits, he said softly. Then he turned away, as if Harrow had served his purpose for the moment. Watson realized what Holmes was doing. He was not interrogating Harrow for drama, he was mapping him. Ink stains, paper cuts, missing keys, small contradictions, a man's habits under pressure. Holmes crossed to the mantel, picked up a small case of matches and struck one. The flame flared briefly, casting a sharper light on the letter's surface. Watson frowned. What are you looking for? The ink, Holmes said. Ink carries more character than handwriting. Handwriting can be trained. Ink is chosen. He tilted the letter, letting the flame's light skim across the lines. Watson leaned in and saw what Holmes saw. The ink was not uniform. The main body was written in a dark, nearly black fluid, but the initials at the bottom, where the signature would have been, were in a slightly different shade, as though the pen had been dipped again into a different bottle. Holmes snuffed the match and set it aside. 2 inks, he murmured. One for the message, another for the mark. Watson's eyes narrowed, so 2 hands. Or 1 hand with access to 2 supplies, Holmes said, which is often as revealing. Watson's gaze drifted to the smaller seal, tucked now near the letter's edge. The symbol on it haunted the room without words. Holmes had not yet spoken the name associated with it. Watson sensed he was holding it back deliberately, as one holds back a match near spilled oil. Holmes lifted the letter again and opened it to a particular line, his finger resting just beneath the words. There, he said. Watson leaned over his shoulder. The line itself looked innocent enough, a phrase that might pass as ordinary correspondence if one were not alert. Yet Holmes's eyes held a quiet intensity. This phrase, Holmes said softly, is not written for the raider. It is written for someone who knows a key. Watson frowned. A key? Holmes nodded. A cipher, he said. Wartime dispatches, certain patterns, the placement of certain words, not for the public and not for the casual clerk. Harrow's face tightened. Military, he whispered. Holmes's gaze remained on the page. Not simply military, he said. Intelligence. Watson felt his pulse quicken. You're sure? Holmes's voice was calm. I have seen the structure before, he said. It is designed to survive inspection. If intercepted, it reads as mundane, but if you know the method, if you have served in the right places, you can extract a second message. Watson stared at the letter, his earlier anger shifting into something colder and more focused. So the writer had access, he said, not only to the archive but to intelligence methods. Holmes nodded, which narrows our pool, he said quietly. Watson's mind leapt instinctively to Pike, to his controlled gaze and his reaction to the mention of a dead man's seal. Then to Sorrel, whose precision could hide obsession. Then to Vale, whose bitterness could hide calculation. Then to Harrow, whose fear could hide a compromise. Holmes closed the letter again as if ending a prayer. We leave the paper now, he said. We follow the lives. Where? Watson asked. Holmes's eyes lifted, the calm intelligence returning. To the places where people become vulnerable, he said. To the places where money slips quietly, where names are traded like currency. Watson's gaze sharpened. Vale. Holmes nodded faintly. Vale. Harrow stiffened. She lives near the repository, he said quickly. She has a room there, you saw. Holmes's tone remained mild. I saw a room, he said, not a life. Watson watched Holmes gather his coat again, as though they were about to step out into the rain once more, and in that moment a thought struck him with uncomfortable clarity. Holmes had not been surprised by any of this, not by the archive's secrecy, not by the warmed seals, not even by the intelligent cipher. He had been surprised only by the photograph. By Watson's name. That was the fracture, the point where the case had broken through the professional barrier and reached for something personal. They went out again into the night, leaving Harrow behind at 221B under Mrs. Hudson's watchful suspicion. Holmes had given him a quiet instruction: stay here, lock the door, speak to no one. Harrow had obeyed like a man grateful to be told how to breathe. London beyond their doorway was wet and restless. The rain had eased into a fine drizzle, and fog now threaded through the street lamps, making every light look distant. The air smelled of damp wool and coal. A few late walkers moved like shadows, heads down, hurried. Holmes and Watson took a cab eastward, Holmes giving the driver an address with the clipped certainty of a man who has already been there in his mind. Margaret Vale's former boarding house sat in a narrow street where the buildings leaned toward one another like conspirators. The door was painted a dull green, the paint cracked at the edges. A small lamp burned above it, offering more duty than light. Holmes knocked, not loudly, but with a precise rhythm. After a pause, the door opened a fraction. A woman's eye appeared in the gap, sharp with suspicion. Yes, she said. Holmes's tone was polite. We are looking for information regarding a former lodger, he said. Margaret Vale. The eye narrowed. No lodgers at this hour, the woman replied, already moving to close the door. Holmes lifted a coin, not thrusting it forward, merely letting it catch the lamplight. A brief conversation, he said softly, and you can return to your sleep. The door opened a little wider. The woman's face appeared, lined, practical, unimpressed. Yet the coin's shine did what coins often do. It suggested this interruption might at least be useful. Vale hasn't lived here in years, the woman said, voice grudging. moved on, took her bitterness with her. Holmes's gaze remained gentle, almost kind. "And yet you remember her," he said. The woman snorted. Hard to forget a woman who counts every penny and expects the world to apologize for taking them. Watson felt a flicker of discomfort. He had seen that kind of person, wounded, hardened, surviving by control. He wondered briefly what had made Vale that way. Holmes's voice remained calm. "Did she receive letters?" he asked. "Payments, visitors?" The woman's eyes narrowed again. "Why do you ask?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because people who leave quietly often leave debts behind," he said, "and I suspect Vale did not leave quietly." The woman hesitated. There were envelopes, she admitted at last. Not every week, but regular enough, always plain, always addressed careful. She'd take them upstairs, lock the door, and come down looking like she'd swallowed nails. Holmes nodded slightly. "From whom?" The woman shrugged. "No name, just some trust. A charity, they said." She made a face disdainful. "Charity? Vale wouldn't take charity. She'd take money, but she'd never call it charity." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Do you remember the name of the trust?" The woman frowned, thinking. Something proper, like Ash. "No, not that." She shook her head. "Sorry, not good with names." Holmes did not press. He did not need her exact memory. He needed the shape of it. "Were the envelopes stamped?" he asked. The woman's eyes flicked upward as if she could see the old letters in her mind. "No stamps," she said slowly. "Not post. Hand-delivered, I'd wager. Sometimes the boy would wait outside like he wanted to see if she opened it." Watson felt the coldness of that detail. Not merely paying her, but watching her receive the payment, controlling her. Holmes nodded. "Thank you," he said, and slipped the coin into her palm with the smoothness of habit. As the door closed, Watson looked at Holmes. "A trust," he murmured. "That doesn't exist." Holmes's eyes were distant, already fitting pieces together. "Trusts exist on paper," he said. "Paper is easy, people are not." They returned to the street, the drizzle soft on their collars. Watson's mind turned over the image of Vale receiving envelopes in secret, then locking her door, swallowing nails. Fear, shame, pride, the emotional engine again. What had she done to earn such a leash? Holmes's steps slowed. He had paused under a street lamp, his gaze fixed on his own hand for a moment. "What is it?" Watson asked. Holmes held up his fingers. On the side of his thumb was a faint stain, dark, almost black, ink. Watson frowned. "From the letter." Holmes shook his head slightly. "Not from the letter," he said, "from the seal." Watson's eyes narrowed. "You touched the wax." "I touched the inner edge," Holmes said. "Enough to pick up residue. It is not ordinary sealing ink. It contains," he paused, as if choosing words that would not become a lecture. "It contains something used to make ink endure, to keep it stable." "Like archive ink," Watson said. Holmes's gaze lifted to him, approving. "Like archive ink," he agreed. "Which means whoever wrote the initials beneath the warning we saw, whoever used that particular ink, had access to the same supply, repository supply, or intelligence supply." Watson's mouth went dry. "So the threat is not only clever," he said, "it is institutional." Holmes's gaze remained calm. "Institutions are made of individuals," he said. "We find the individual." For a moment they walked in silence, the drizzle whispering on stone. Watson's earlier anger returned, but softer now, more pained than sharp. "Sorrel," Watson said suddenly. "She reacted to the Ashdown box like it was a wound." Holmes nodded. "A wound can drive a person farther than greed," he said. They took another cab, this time to an address Holmes had extracted from a brief exchange in the repository corridor, Sorrel's office at a small historical society. It was late, and yet a light burned in the window, pale and steady, as though Sorrel were incapable of leaving a question unanswered long enough to sleep. She opened the door herself when Holmes knocked. Her hair was slightly looser now, a few strands escaping her pins, the only sign that she was human rather than carved from discipline. "Mr. Holmes," she said, voice controlled, "I didn't invite you." Holmes's tone was polite. "No," he said, "but you left your lamp burning. That is an invitation in its own way." Sorrel's eyes narrowed, then reluctantly she stepped aside. Inside, the office smelled of paper and cold tea. Books lined the walls. Documents lay stacked in neat piles, as if chaos had been arranged into something tolerable. A photograph frame sat turned face down on her desk, like something she refused to look at. Watson's gaze flicked to it instinctively. Sorrel noticed. Her hand moved, covering the frame with a file as though it were a shameful thing. Holmes's eyes softened slightly. "Dr. Sorrel," he said, "you have petitioned the repository repeatedly, not for curiosity, for something specific." Sorrel's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." Holmes's voice remained calm. "Your father," he said quietly. The word landed. Sorrel went still. For a moment Watson thought she might throw them out. Then she turned away, moving to the kettle, though it was clear she had no intention of making tea. It was simply movement, an attempt to regain control. "My father is dead," she said, voice tight. "And his name," Holmes said, "was ruined while he lived." Sorrel's hand trembled slightly as she lifted the kettle, then set it down again, untouched. She kept her back to them. Watson felt the heaviness of the room, the way certain truths press against walls. Holmes did not push with cruelty. He pushed with precision. "You have spent your life," Holmes continued, "chasing the author of an anonymous letter." Sorrel's shoulders rose with a shallow breath. "He was accused," she said, voice low. "In public, in print, he was called a thief of documents, a peddler of secrets. He died with people whispering behind their hands." Watson felt a pang of sympathy. Disgrace is a slow poison. It spreads through families. It makes children carry burdens they did not earn. Holmes's tone remained gentle. "And you want justice," he said. Sorrel turned sharply, eyes bright with something raw. "No," she said, and the honesty in the words startled even her. "I want proof." Holmes's gaze held hers. "Proof of what?" Sorrel's voice cracked slightly. "Proof that he was not what they said," she whispered. "Proof that my life, my education, my work, my place in rooms where people smile politely, was not built on a lie." Watson saw it then. Not vengeance, not mere curiosity. Shame. The deep, private kind that forces a person to become perfect because imperfection would feel like confirmation. Holmes nodded once, as if acknowledging her humanity. "Then you are not hunting the author for punishment," he said softly. "You are hunting them to reclaim a name." Sorrel's eyes flashed with tears she refused to let fall. "You talk as if you understand," she said bitterly. Holmes's expression did not change, but something in his gaze tightened. "I understand enough," he said. "A name is not merely a word, it is a life scaffolding." Watson glanced at Holmes, and the earlier mention of mercy returned. Holmes's old moral fault line, the difference between solving and deciding what truth should survive. Watson had seen Holmes destroy reputations when necessary and protect them when deserved. He had never seen Holmes admit the weight of that choice so plainly. Holmes's voice remained calm. "Dr. Sorrel," he said, "did you enter the Ashdown corridor this week?" Sorrel's chin lifted. "No," she said immediately, too immediately. Holmes did not accuse, he simply observed. "Your left sleeve has a faint line of candle soot," he said. "Fresh, from a glass housing. You brushed it recently. Sorrel's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. I work with candles, she said sharply. I work with old things. Holmes's tone stayed mild. And yet your office uses modern lamps, he said. And your candle soot is of the repository's particular mixture, paraffin with a trace of beeswax, used to keep the flames steady without smoke. Sorrel's jaw clenched. Watson saw the moment she realized she had been seen. Holmes softened his voice. I am not asking to trap you, he said. I am asking because someone is moving through those records. Someone has already killed, perhaps an archivist who stood in their way. If you have been there, you may be in danger as well. Sorrel's breath trembled. For a moment she looked like she might keep fighting. Then the fight drained into exhaustion. I went, she admitted. Not into Ashdown, not fully. I stood at the gate. I wanted to see it. I wanted to feel that it was real. I wanted to believe my father's ruin was not simply a story people told to amuse themselves. Watson felt the ache in it, the need to touch the thing that hurt you, just to confirm it exists. Holmes nodded. Did you see anyone? He asked. Sorrel hesitated, then shook her head. No, she said, but I felt watched. Watson's spine tightened. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Watched by whom? Sorrel's voice dropped. By the building, she whispered. By the records. By the idea that the past is not finished with you. Holmes held her gaze for a beat, then nodded slightly, as if accepting her answer as truth even if it was not yet useful. As they turned to leave, Watson paused at the desk and glanced again at the hidden frame. Sorrel's hand moved instinctively toward it, protective. Watson did not touch it, he did not ask. He simply understood. Everyone in this case was guarding a photograph, a letter, a name. Outside, the fog had thickened. The street lamps glowed like distant moons. Holmes and Watson walked in silence for several yards, the wet cobblestones whispering underfoot. Then Holmes spoke, and his voice was quieter than before. If you are still with me, he said, not looking at Watson but at the street ahead, you'll want to hear what was uncovered next. Because this is the point in a case where the paper stops being paper and starts becoming people. Watson understood the meaning beneath the gentle invitation. Stay with me, Holmes was saying, not as an audience member but as a partner, even if your name is on the line. They returned to 221B near midnight. The sitting room was dim, the fire low. Mrs. Hudson had left a lamp burning and a plate covered with cloth that no one touched. Harrow sat stiffly in the armchair, as if he had not moved. When he saw them, he rose too quickly, relief and fear flickering across his face. Holmes went straight to the table and opened the sealed letter again. He did not read it aloud now. He studied the coded phrase, then took a pencil and began to mark small points, spacing, word choice, placement. Watson watched, intrigued despite himself. You said it matches wartime dispatches, Watson murmured. Holmes nodded faintly. Not simply matches, he said. It is built from them. The writer has lived inside that system. They know how to hide meaning under meaning. Watson felt a chill. Then the writer could be intelligence. Holmes's eyes remained on the page. Or someone who served intelligence, he said. Or someone who stole their methods. Watson's gaze drifted to the smaller seal again. The mark of a dead man. The name Holmes still refused to say. What about that? Watson asked quietly. Who is supposed to be dead? Holmes's pencil paused. For a moment the only sound was Harrow's shallow breathing and the soft tick of the mantel clock. Holmes lifted his eyes to Watson, and Watson saw something there that was rare. Hesitation that was not uncertainty, but choice. There are names, Holmes said softly, that are dangerous not because they are powerful, but because they are contagious. Speak them, and people begin to behave differently. Watson's jaw tightened. "I am already behaving differently," he said. Holmes's gaze held his for a moment longer, then dropped back to the letter. "Soon," he said quietly, "when we have something solid enough to hold." Watson felt the frustration rise, but he swallowed it. Holmes was right about one thing: panic would not help. Yet Watson could not shake the sense that Holmes was not merely protecting him. Holmes was protecting himself from a memory, from a mistake, from a mercy that had turned sour. A sharp knock sounded at the door below. Not the frantic pounding of Harrow's arrival. This knock was brisk, controlled, like a hand trained to deliver messages without emotion. Watson's pulse quickened. Harrow went pale again, as if the night had learned a new way to terrorize him. Holmes did not move at once. He listened, head slightly inclined, eyes half-lidded. Then he spoke calmly. "A messenger," he said. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted faintly from the stairwell, cautious. Then footsteps climbed. A boy appeared at the sitting-room door, cap damp, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes wide with the excitement and fear of being sent to a famous address at an unusual hour. He held out a small folded scrap of paper, not an envelope. No seal, no stamp, just something cut quickly and delivered quickly. Holmes took it between two fingers. Watson watched the boy's hands. They trembled slightly. Ink stained one thumb fresh. "Who sent you?" Watson asked gently. The boy swallowed. "A man," he said. "He didn't give a name. He paid me to run." Holmes unfolded the scrap. It was cut from newsprint, the edges rough. The message upon it was short, printed letters trimmed and pasted like a crude threat, yet beneath the pasted words someone had written in ink, neat, controlled, familiar in its restraint. "Stop reading the dead." Watson felt the room tighten. Harrow made a small sound, like a breath choking. Holmes's eyes moved lower. Beneath the warning were two initials, written with the same dark, enduring ink Holmes had identified on the sealed letter. Holmes's own childhood initials. And for the first time that night, even the steady orange of the fire seemed to dim, as though the past had leaned close enough to breathe on the flame. Holmes's childhood initials, written in the same enduring ink as the sealed letter, sat on the scrap of newsprint like a small, deliberate bruise on the night, and for a long moment no one in the sitting room spoke, as if speech might make the threat more real. The fire gave a tired crackle. The mantel clock ticked with maddening steadiness. Mrs. Hudson had long since retreated, sensing instinctively that this was not an evening for questions. Harrow stood near the door with his hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles shone pale. Watson held the scrap between two fingers and felt the rough edge of the cut paper, felt the dryness of the ink that had been laid down with confident restraint. Holmes read it once more, then placed it beside the sealed letter with precise care. He did not appear shaken. Yet Watson saw the smallest shift at the base of his throat when he swallowed, something quick and human that betrayed the pressure beneath his calm. "That is your hand," Watson said quietly. Holmes's gaze did not leave the paper. "It is an imitation," he replied. Watson's voice tightened. "Then someone has imitated you since childhood." Holmes's eyes lifted to Watson at last. "Someone has known of me since childhood," he said, and the distinction mattered. Harrow's voice came out thin. "How could anyone know your childhood initials?" Holmes's mouth twitched faintly, humorless. "There are records," he said. "School registers, old letters, a boy's pride written in a corner. All it takes is access and patience and the kind of mind that enjoys reaching backward." Watson felt the chill of it. This was no longer merely a sealed archive compromised. This was a man, an intellect, standing close enough to Holmes's own life to pluck private fragments and lay them out like bait. Holmes rose and moved to the writing table, where he began to arrange objects with the care of a man building a model. The sealed letter, the scrap warning, a blank sheet, a small tin of tobacco, his lens, a match, even the photograph from Ashdown, which he placed face down, as if acknowledging its power without feeding it. "What are you doing?" Watson asked, though he suspected. Holmes spoke without looking up. "Reconstruction," he said. "When a man hides behind confusion, you remove it. When he hides behind fear, you apply pressure. When he hides behind a system, you use the system against him." Watson felt Harrow shift behind him. "You mean the repository," Harrow murmured. Holmes nodded once. "They want me to stop reading the dead," he said, "which means the dead have something to say, and the living are afraid of who will be blamed for listening." Watson's gaze held him, and the initials. Holmes's voice stayed calm. "A reminder," he said, "that this is not merely an archive dispute. It is personal to the writer, and it is meant to become personal to me." Watson's chest tightened. "It already has," he said, thinking of the photograph, thinking of his surname sitting beneath a stranger's eyes. Holmes's pencil began to move. He wrote times, dates, and small notes. Ledger entry, warmed seal, courier, warning scrap, soot line, paper cut. He drew a line connecting the Ashdown box to the letter's arrival, then drew another line from the warning scrap to his own initials. He paused, pencil hovering. "The simplest question," he said softly, "is not who wrote the letter. It is who had cause to insert my initials beneath that warning." Watson frowned. "The author." "Not necessarily," Holmes said. "The author may be proud, or cautious, or both, but the person who delivered the warning is in London now. They have a messenger boy, they know our address, they have watched the night unfold." Harrow's breath caught. "Then we're being followed." Holmes's gaze remained on his page. "We have been followed since the courier," he said. Watson felt the shape of the trap closing in, not on them physically, but around their choices. The case was narrowing, not widening, and narrowing was dangerous. When a mystery narrows, someone begins to panic. Holmes looked up. "We return to the repository," he said simply. Harrow's face tightened. "At this hour?" "Yes," Holmes replied, "before the morning brings officials and committees and convenient excuses. We need a place where the truth cannot escape through a crowd." Watson studied him. "You're going to confront them." Holmes's expression was calm. "Not confront," he said. "Contain." Harrow swallowed. "Inspector Pike won't allow it." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Inspector Pike is already allowing more than he admits," he said. "He is not merely watching us, he is guarding something." Watson remembered Pike's reaction at the repository, the slight disturbance at the mention of a seal belonging to a dead man. Watson's stomach tightened. Holmes's voice was quiet. "Stability," he said, "not justice, that is Pike's true loyalty." They took a cab through the thinning night. London was quieter now, the streets less crowded, the lamps fewer. The rain had eased into a damp fog that made the city feel like a dream of itself. As the cab rolled through narrow lanes, Watson watched Holmes's profile and wondered, for the first time in a long while, what it felt like to be Holmes on a night when someone reached into his past and threatened to pull something out. At the repository gate, a uniformed man was indeed watching, as Pike had promised. He stood beneath the iron arch with his collar up, eyes scanning the street. When he saw Holmes, he stiffened. "Mr. Holmes," he said. Holmes's tone was mild. "Inspector Pike here." The man hesitated. "Inside," he said. He instructed. Holmes cut him off gently. "Then we follow instructions," he said, and moved through the gate as though the building belonged to his purpose. Inside, the repository looked even more severe than before. The courtyard stone held the damp like memory. The air inside the corridor was cool and dry, the gaslight steady and dull. Pike met them near the alcove desk, his coat buttoned, his expression hard. "You returned," he said, as if surprised and yet not. Holmes held up the scrap of newsprint. "A message," he said. Pike's eyes flicked to it, then away. "You're being threatened," he said flatly. Holmes's voice stayed calm. "Not merely threatened," he said. "Directed." Pike's jaw tightened. "Then you should go home." Holmes's gaze held him. "I was home," he said. "They sent the threat there." For a moment Pike said nothing. Watson watched him carefully now, as Holmes clearly intended. Pike's eyes moved to Harrow, to Watson, then back to Holmes. There was a faint tension at his temple, a subtle sign of a man carrying a weight he cannot set down. Holmes's voice softened by a fraction. "Inspector," he said, "your loyalty is admirable, but if you are loyal to stability at the cost of truth, you will end by protecting the very thing that will destroy stability." Pike's eyes narrowed. "You think I'm protecting someone?" Holmes did not answer directly. "I think you are protecting a secret," he said, "and secrets do not stay contained when men begin dying in archive corridors." Pike's jaw worked. Rook's death was an accident. Vale's voice came from the corridor behind them, low and sharp. "You say that like a prayer," she said. She stepped into the alcove, arms folded, eyes fierce. Sorrel followed a moment later, coat pulled tight, hair pinned back again, face composed as if she had dressed herself in discipline. "You summoned us," Sorrel said to Harrow, tone clipped. Harrow looked guilty. I didn't know what else." Holmes lifted a hand gently. "I did," he said. All eyes turned to him. Holmes stood in that narrow alcove like a man about to perform a demonstration, not for show, but for necessity. The building's silence pressed in. Even the sergeant at the desk glanced up, sensing the shift. Holmes spoke calmly. "We will go to a records room," he said, "one without windows, one with a single door. We will place ourselves inside it, and we will speak plainly." Pike's eyes hardened. "You cannot lock officials in a room." Holmes's tone remained mild. "I can request a private interview," he said. "And if you refuse, Inspector, I will be forced to shout questions in a hallway where every clerk can hear. Your stability will become very noisy." Pike stared at him. Watson saw the calculation behind Pike's eyes. Pride versus control. Public embarrassment versus private risk. Pike exhaled through his nose. "Fine," he said. "1 room, 1 hour, and if you try to turn this into blackmail." Holmes's eyes were calm. "Blackmail is what we are discussing," he said, "not what I am offering." They moved through the corridors again, past locked doors and steady gaslight, into a part of the repository Watson had not seen before. Here the rooms were smaller, the ceilings lower, the walls closer. Holmes chose a door set into a thick stone wall. Pike unlocked it with a key he carried, another small detail of authority that betrayed how deeply he was involved. Inside, the records room was plain. No windows, a long table, a few shelves with bound volumes, a single lamp on the table, a desk lamp with a glass shade, modern compared to the candles. The air was still. The silence felt absolute. Holmes entered first, then Watson. Harrow followed, then Sorrel, then Vale. Pike stepped in last, closing the door behind him with a firm click that sounded, in the windowless space, like a verdict. For a moment, no one moved. Then Holmes placed objects on the table as though arranging exhibits. The sealed letter, the warning scrap, the smaller inner seal, a sheet of paper with Holmes's notes. "We are here," Holmes said calmly, "because the sequence has been altered, not by accident, by design." Pike folded his arms. "Then explain," he said, quickly. Holmes's voice was steady, documentary in its clarity. First, he said, the Ashdown box was opened. The seal warmed. The wire snapped and replaced. This happened 2 or 3 days ago, likely on the night Thomas Rook died. Harrow flinched, Vale's jaw tightened, Sorrel's eyes narrowed. Holmes continued. Second, a letter within the box, one logged officially as destroyed, was extracted. That implies foreknowledge. Someone knew it existed, and someone ensured its destruction was only paperwork. Pike's gaze sharpened. You're accusing the repository. Holmes shook his head slightly. I am accusing a person within it, he said, or a person with access to it. He tapped the ledger notes. Third, someone inserted a replacement into the Ashdown box, he said, not to hide that it had been disturbed, but to frame a particular narrative, to ensure that when the box was examined, suspicion would fall in a controlled direction. Vale's eyes flashed. You mean to frame me, she said, voice low. Holmes met her gaze. You are convenient, he said simply. A former code clerk, bitter, isolated, holding a key. If the letter's movement is discovered, you are the obvious culprit. Vale's lips curled, but there was pain beneath her anger. And you think I'd be foolish enough to warm seals and forge ledgers? She snapped. I know how these people bury you. Holmes's tone remained calm. Which is why you would not do it, he said. You would know that if you were caught, you would not be punished openly. You would be erased. Watson watched Vale, saw her swallow hard, saw the flicker in her eyes. Erased. It was the word that lived in this case. Holmes's gaze shifted to Sorrel. Dr. Sorrel, he said, you are also convenient. A woman obsessed with a sealed scandal. A woman who could plausibly breach a collection out of desperation. Sorrel's chin lifted. I did not open Ashdown, she said sharply. Holmes nodded. I know, he said, and her eyes flashed with brief surprise, both relief and irritation at being read so quickly. Harrow's voice trembled. Then who, he whispered, who could do all this? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the smaller inner seal and held it to the lamp. The symbol carved into the wax looked darker here, more precise. Watson saw Pike's eyes flicker again. This seal, Holmes said softly, is not merely a mark. It is a signature of intent. The person who used it expected me to notice it. Pike's voice tightened. Don't play games, Holmes. Holmes's gaze turned to him. Inspector, he said, why did you react when I mentioned a man thought dead? Why do you carry keys to rooms you claim you do not control? Why was Rook's death filed as an accident before anyone examined the body? Pike's jaw worked. Because I am responsible for keeping this place from becoming a riot, he said. Because you don't understand what would happen if the Ashdown secrets became public. Holmes's voice stayed calm. You understand perfectly, he said, and you have been safeguarding a living secret that could topple careers. Pike's eyes hardened. I safeguard the country, he snapped. Holmes's reply was quiet. You safeguard reputations, he said, and you call it the country so you can sleep. The silence fell like dust. Watson felt the room tighten. The intellectual engine was now pressing against the emotional, Pike's pride, Sorrel's shame, Vale's bitterness, Harrow's fear. Holmes had brought them into a windowless room not to interrogate them in the usual sense, but to remove their exits. No doorways to slip out of, no windows to distract. Only pressure. Holmes placed the warning scrap on the table and tapped the initials. This, he said, was delivered tonight. The ink matches the sealed letter's ink. The hand is careful. The person who wrote it has access to durable ink supplies, archive or intelligence. Watson's gaze sharpened. And the cipher, he murmured. Holmes nodded. Yes, he said. The sealed letter contains a coded phrase consistent with wartime intelligence dispatch methods. Not a child's trick, not a clerk's whim. It was written by someone trained. Sorrel's eyes narrowed. You keep circling the same point, she said, voice controlled. Who? Holmes looked at Harrow. Bring the Ashdown ledger, he said. Harrow hesitated. It is sealed. Holmes's tone was firm but calm. Bring it, he said. Pike's jaw tightened. No documents lave. Holmes cut him off gently. We are not laving, he said. We are reading. Pike stared, then exhaled sharply. Fine, he said, but I watch. Harrow hurried out, Vale following with grim determination. The door opened briefly, then shut again, the sound echoing in the windowless room like a pulse. While they were gone, Holmes turned to Watson, and his voice softened. I must ask you something, he said quietly. Watson's chest tightened. Ask. Holmes's eyes held his for a moment. That photograph, he said. The surname, your family, did they ever speak of a man who disappeared? Watson felt the old discomfort rise, sharp and strange. No, he said quickly. Then he stopped, the word catching. No, and yet families do not always speak. They bury, they erase. Holmes's gaze did not judge him. It simply waited. Watson exhaled. There were stories, he admitted reluctantly. Whispers, perhaps, a cousin or an uncle, someone who went abroad and was never mentioned again. It was spoken of once when I was young, then shut down. My aunt, she snapped at my mother for even bringing it up. Holmes nodded slowly. Shame, he murmured, and survival. Watson's voice tightened. You think the photograph is that man? Holmes's gaze held him. I think the photograph is meant to look like you, he said softly, so your mind will leap to the wrong conclusion. Watson felt the sting of it. It worked, he admitted, for a moment. Holmes's voice was calm. It was designed to, he said. Then he looked away, and Watson sensed again that Holmes's own past was pressing close, his mercy, his old fault line. The door opened. Harrow and Vale returned with the ledger and a thin stack of files. Vale carried them like a woman carrying a dangerous child, careful, tense, protective. Holmes cleared space on the table and opened the ledger under the lamp. The pages lay flat, the ink columns steady. Holmes's finger moved to the destroyed entry again, then to the recatalogued line. Here, he said, the false clerk number. Sorrel leaned in. Pike leaned too, though he tried to hide it. Harrow hovered, eyes darting. Holmes's voice was quiet. This clerk number, he said, is not random. It follows the pattern of internal coding used only by one department. Pike's eyes narrowed. Which department? Holmes looked at him. The department that liaises with intelligence, he said. Pike's jaw tightened. You're implying. I am stating, Holmes replied softly. Vale's voice cut in bitter. So not a myth, she murmured. Not a single quiet man, a system. Holmes nodded. Exactly, he said. The quiet man was never a single witness. Sorrel's eyes sharpened. What do you mean? Holmes tapped the ledger line. The quiet man, he said, was a rotating identity, a name used by multiple clerks. When blackmail information needed to speak, it spoke through a mask. No one source, no one throat to cut. Watson felt the grim elegance of it. A system designed to survive exposure. A whisper that could never be pinned to one mouth. Harrow's face went pale. That would mean, he swallowed. That means the repository itself was structured to enable blackmail. Vale's eyes flashed. Of course it was, she said, voice low. Power always keeps records of what it can use. Pike slammed a hand on the table. The sound cracked through the silence. Enough, he snapped. You speak as if you understand governance. You don't. You speak as if everything is corruption. It is. Holmes's gaze remained calm. But this is, he said, and his voice held no triumph, only inevitability. Pike's eyes hardened. And what do you plan to do? He demanded. Drag it into the street, feed it to newspapers, destroy men's lives because you enjoy the puzzle. Watson felt the accusation hit close. He saw Holmes's jaw tighten slightly. Holmes spoke quietly. I plan to stop someone from killing again, he said, and I plan to stop someone from using sealed records as a weapon. Pike's voice was harsh. Weapons are sometimes necessary. Holmes's eyes held him. So are consequences, he replied. Sorrel's voice cut in, trembling with restraint. If the quiet man was a mask, she said, then the anonymous letter that ruined my father. She stopped, breath catching. Holmes's gaze turned to her gentle. Could have been written by anyone wearing it, he said. Sorrel's eyes shone. Then I've been chasing a phantom, she whispered. Watson watched her, the ache in her face. A lifetime of work, built on the need to prove she was not born from disgrace, now confronted with the possibility that there was no single villain to drag into the light. Only a system, only masks. That kind of truth was harder to endure than a simple enemy. Vale's voice was low. Masks keep you alive, she said, until they don't. Holmes turned a page in the ledger. His finger moved to a column of initials, tiny marks beside certain entries, as though confirming oversight. Watson leaned closer and saw that some initials repeated in patterns. Others appeared only once. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Here, he said softly. He pointed to a set of initials that appeared near the destroyed entry and again near the recatalogue. The same hand, the same ink, a quiet confirmation. Watson's heart beat faster. Whose initials? Holmes's eyes lifted, not to answer but to watch the room. Pike's face had tightened. Harrow's mouth parted slightly. Sorrel's breath stopped for a fraction of a second. Vale's eyes narrowed. Holmes spoke quietly. Someone here recognizes them, he said. Silence. The lamp hummed faintly. The air felt heavy. Holmes waited. It was not a theatrical pause. It was the pause of a man letting pressure do what shouting cannot. Pike's voice came at last, low and controlled. Those are not for discussion, he said. Holmes's gaze remained steady. Then you have just confirmed their importance, he replied. Watson felt the tension peak. The room had become a vice, tightening around Pike's loyalty and whatever secret he was protecting. Vale's voice cut in, sharp and unexpected. The initials belong to a man who doesn't exist, she said. All eyes turned to her. Vale's jaw clenched. A name used like quiet man, she said. A liaison who came and went, never on the public roster. He signed with initials. He never wrote a full name. We were told to accept it. Harrow's face drained. That can't be, he began. Vale's eyes flashed. It can, she snapped. It did. Holmes's gaze sharpened. And you, he said softly to Vale, received payments. Vale's mouth tightened. Yes, she said, and the word came out like surrender. From a trust, a charitable trust, a ghost trust. Paid to keep my mouth shut, paid to keep me here as the convenient scapegoat. Watson watched her hands tremble slightly, then still. She was ashamed, not of taking money, but of being trapped by it, of being reduced to a controlled narrative. Holmes's voice was quiet. Who delivered the payments? He asked. Vale's eyes darted to Pike, then away. Not Pike, she said quickly. A clerk, a boy sometimes, a man in a messenger cap. Watson felt the pieces align. The boarding house keeper's memory, the messenger boy, the ink-stained thumb. Holmes's gaze sharpened further. And did this trust ever sign its name? He asked. Vale's mouth twisted. Never, she said, only initials. Watson's pulse hammered. Which initials? He asked. Vale's eyes lifted, and in them was anger, shame, and fear. The same ones, she said quietly, the ones in that ledger. Pike's face went hard. You're lying, he snapped. Vale's laugh was bitter. I've lied for years, she said. This isn't one of them. Holmes lifted his hand slightly, calming the surge. Now, he said softly, we are close. Watson felt the room tilt. Close to what? Close to the author. Close to the dead man's seal. Close to Holmes's old mercy. Holmes opened the sealed letter again and turned to the coded phrase. He read it silently, lips barely moving. Then he looked up. The writer expected me, he said quietly. Not merely to investigate, to arrive here, to gather you in a room with no windows, to apply pressure. Sorrel's voice was thin. How can you know that? Holmes's gaze held hers. Because the letter is not just confession, he said. It is instruction. It is staged. Watson's stomach tightened. An ultimatum, he murmured. Holmes nodded. And revenge, he added softly. Harrow's voice cracked. Revenge against whom? Holmes's eyes moved to Pike, then to Vale, then to Sorrel, then to Watson. Finally, they returned to the smaller inner seal, the mark of the dead man. Holmes spoke very quietly. Revenge against a choice I made, he said, and against the people who benefited from that choice. Watson's breath caught. Your mercy, he whispered. Holmes did not deny it. The room felt suddenly smaller. Watson realized that whatever Holmes had spared in the past had not stayed spared. It had grown teeth. It had learned patience. Holmes's gaze was distant for a moment, as if seeing a younger version of himself in another room, another night, another decision. Then the calm returned, hardening into purpose. We will set the final trap, Holmes said softly. Pike's eyes narrowed. What trap? Holmes's voice was calm. We will draw the author out, he said, not by chasing, but by letting them believe they are in control. Sorrel's voice tightened. And how do you do that? Holmes placed his hand on the sealed letter. By doing what they want, he said, reading. Watson's chest tightened. Holmes. Holmes met his gaze. Not blindly, he said, precisely. Pike's voice was harsh. You will not read it aloud here. Holmes's eyes were calm. That depends, he said softly, on whether you intend to stop me physically. For a moment Pike looked as if he might. Then he hesitated. Watson saw it, the fear beneath Pike's authority. Not fear of Holmes. Fear of what the final page might reveal. Fear of the toppled careers, the collapsing stability. Holmes's voice softened. Inspector, he said quietly, if the truth will topple you, it was already unstable. It was merely waiting. Pike's jaw clenched. You don't understand, he said, voice lower now. Men will burn everything to avoid being shamed. Holmes's eyes were steady. Yes, he said, that is why Thomas Rook is dead. The word struck Harrow like a blow. He swayed slightly, gripping the table edge. Vale's face tightened. Sorrel's eyes flashed with something like grief, perhaps for her father, perhaps for herself. Watson felt the truth of it sink. Rook had been careful. Rook had been an inconvenience, and inconveniences are removed quietly in places built for quiet. Holmes's gaze moved to Watson again, and his voice softened just enough to be human. Your surname, he said. The photograph, it is time you know. Watson's mouth went dry. Know what? Holmes's eyes held his. The young man in the photograph, he said quietly, is not you. It was never meant to be you. It was meant to make you believe it was you. Watson's breath caught. Then who is he? Holmes's voice was calm, careful. A relative, he said. A man who used your surname to vanish. Someone your family erased from memory to survive social ruin. Watson felt as if the floor beneath the windowless room had shifted. Erased, he whispered. The word again. The case was full of it. Sorrel's gaze softened for the first time, just slightly, as if she recognized the shape of that pain. Vale looked away, jaw tight. Harrow stared, shocked, as though he had not considered that a family could be forced to amputate its own history. Watson's voice came out strained. How can you know that? Holmes's gaze held him. Because the photograph is labeled with a clerk's hand, he said softly, not a family hand, and because the posture is not that of a man proud to be seen, it is the posture of a man being recorded. Watson felt anger and sorrow twist together. My family, he murmured. What did they do? Holmes's voice stayed gentle. They survived, he said, and survival can look like cruelty from the outside. Watson swallowed. The fracture between him and Holmes from earlier deepened, not because Holmes had kept secrets, but because Watson realized that his own life contained sealed compartments he had never dared to open. Holmes turned back to the table, and in that moment the intellectual engine surged again, pulling the emotional along with it. I know who wrote the sealed letter, Holmes said softly. A silence snapped into place. Harrow's breath hitched, Sorrel's eyes widened, Vale's gaze sharpened. Pike's face went very still. Watson felt his pulse hammer. Who? He asked. Holmes did not speak the name yet. He looked at Pike. You know, Holmes said quietly, that is why you are here. That is why you carry keys. That is why you call murder an accident. That is why you fear what is on the final page. Pike's jaw clenched. You're wrong, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Holmes's voice remained calm. The author, he said, is not a ghost. He is a man who expected me to solve this and come to this building tonight. He expected me to gather you. He expected me to be forced into a choice. Watson's voice was tight. What choice? Holmes's eyes drifted to the sealed letter. Whether to read the final page aloud, he said quietly, whether to unmake a name. The room felt like it held its breath. Then somewhere beyond the thick stone walls, a faint click sounded, soft, metallic. The lamp on the table flickered once. Pike's eyes snapped toward the ceiling. What was that? Holmes did not move, he listened. Another click, another flicker. The light in the corridor outside dimmed. Then, as if the repository itself had begun to blink, the gaslights went out one by one, distant, sequential, retreating into darkness like a line of soldiers stepping back. The windowless room became an island of light, the desk lamp on the table suddenly the only steady glow. Harrow's voice broke. What's happening? Holmes's face remained calm, but Watson saw his shoulders tighten slightly. Someone has entered the lighting corridor, Holmes said softly, and they want us contained. The lamp hummed, the surrounding darkness pressed close. Then the lamp itself flickered again, dimmed, recovered, dimmed. Watson felt his heart hammer. He reached instinctively toward his coat pocket where a small revolver rested, but he did not draw it, not yet. Sound mattered, movement mattered. The lamp dimmed once more, then steadied. And in the thick darkness beyond the room, just outside the range of the lamp's circle, a voice spoke. Low, controlled, familiar in its restraint. Read the final page aloud, Mr. Holmes, the voice said, calm as a man giving a household instruction, or Dr. Watson dies in silence. Read the final page aloud, Mr. Holmes, or Dr. Watson dies in silence. The voice came from the dark beyond the desk lamp's circle, low and controlled, as if it belonged to the building itself. In the windowless records room, the air seemed to tighten. The lamp's glass shade threw a small pool of light over the table, over the sealed letter, the scrap warning, the ledger open like an exposed vein, while every corner beyond that pool became a place where anything could be waiting. Watson felt the instinctive cold of it in his bones. A threat spoken without haste is always more dangerous than a threat shouted. Pike's hand went under his coat. Vale's shoulders rose and fell once, sharply. Harrow stood frozen, eyes wide, lips parted. Dr. Sorrel did not flinch, but her fingers tightened on the table edge until her nails paled. Holmes did not reach for a weapon. He did not step back. He did not even raise his voice. He simply lifted the sealed letter by its upper corner, slowly, so that everyone could see his hands were empty of trickery. The paper made a faint, dry sound as it shifted. In that small sound, Watson heard something like permission, Holmes telling the room, and the darkness beyond it, that the next move would not be panic. Holmes spoke into the dark with calm precision. "You have turned off the archive lights in sequence," he said. "Not at the main valve, or we would have been plunged into immediate darkness. You want fear, you want focus, you want my attention aimed at the paper." The darkness did not answer. Holmes's voice remained even. "You have also chosen your threat carefully," he continued. "Not shoot him, not stab him. You said he will die in silence. That implies something quieter, something that leaves no wound to display." Watson's fingers slid toward his revolver, but he did not draw it. A gun in darkness often becomes a promise you cannot fulfill. Holmes turned the letter over once, as if weighing its pages. "You want the final page read aloud," he said, "because you believe that if it is spoken, it becomes inevitable. It becomes public. It becomes an unsealed name." The voice in the dark answered at last, faintly amused. "Read," it said. Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Very well," he said softly, "but you will listen carefully, because I will not read what you think I will read." Pike snapped, low and furious, "Holmes." Holmes did not look at him. "Inspector," he said quietly, "you have already lost control of this room. Your next choice is whether you lose your conscience as well." Pike's breath hissed through his teeth, but he did not move. Holmes lowered his eyes to the page and began to read. His voice was not theatrical. It was documentary calm, the voice of a man giving evidence. He read the confession spine first, the portion that could disarm a threat rather than detonate it. He read dates. He read the phrase that confirmed the Ashdown box had been reopened. He read the admission that Thomas Rook had not fallen by accident, that a quiet hand had arranged the misstep, and ensured no one examined the body. Harrow made a small sound, half grief, half horror. Vale's eyes went bright, then hard. Sorrel's mouth tightened as if she were biting down on years. Holmes read the section that described the quiet man not as a single witness, but as a rotating identity, clerks passing a mask between them, so that blackmail could speak without a throat to cut. He read the portion that revealed the charitable trust was a sham, an instrument to keep certain mouths paid and certain lives contained. Watson watched Pike's face. The inspector's expression remained controlled, but the tension in his jaw was unmistakable. The confession was carving close to something Pike had tried to protect. Holmes read the section that identified the author's guiding belief. That truth was not a right, but a weapon only the powerful deserve to hold. As Holmes spoke those lines, the lamp flickered faintly, as though the building itself reacted. And still Holmes did not read the one line the writer truly wanted spoken. Watson could feel it, could feel the shape of the withheld sentence hovering just beyond Holmes's voice, like a blade held just out of sight. The darkness beyond the lamplight shifted. Watson heard a soft scrape, cloth on stone, perhaps, a breath taken deliberately. "You're omitting," the voice said. Holmes did not look up. "I am choosing," he replied. "Read the name," the voice demanded, and for the first time the control slipped enough for something raw to show beneath it. Need, fury, hunger. Holmes's eyes lifted, not to the darkness, but to the people at the table. Vale, Sorrel, Harrow, Pike, Watson. Then Holmes spoke quietly, and Watson felt the room change. "The final line," Holmes said, "is not evidence, it is cruelty." The voice in the dark went still. Holmes continued, calm as ever. "You want me to speak a name that would destroy what remains of an innocent life's dignity," he said. "You want me to turn your revenge into inevitability. You want me to do your worst work for you." Silence pressed in. Even the lamp seemed to hold its breath. Then the voice laughed softly, an ugly, controlled sound. "Innocent," it said, tasting the word with contempt. "There are no innocents in archives, Mr. Holmes, only the powerful and the forgotten." Holmes's voice sharpened by a fraction. "That is your faith," he said, "and it is the reason you are dangerous." Watson felt movement in the dark again, closer now. His hand tightened around the revolver grip in his pocket, ready. Holmes lifted the letter higher, and the lamplight caught the paper's edge. "You have already confessed enough," Holmes said. "Enough to expose your method, enough to expose your access, enough to expose your motive." The voice hissed, "Expose me, then." Holmes's gaze turned, not to the darkness, but to Pike. "Inspector," Holmes said quietly, "you know who stands there." Pike's face went rigid. "No," he said, too fast. Holmes's voice stayed calm. "You recognize the seal," he said. "You recognize the cipher. You recognize the ledger initials. You have been guarding a living secret, and you have convinced yourself it is stability." Pike's hand trembled once beneath his coat. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, voice low. Holmes replied softly, "I am preventing you from being used." Then Holmes turned his gaze to the darkness at last, and Watson felt the exactness of his attention like a pressure wave. "You turned off the lights one by one," Holmes said. "A clerk could not do that, not without access to the maintenance corridor. You used a key that is not issued to ordinary staff. You also arranged the accident report for Thomas Rook to be filed before inquiry. You needed procedure to move faster than conscience." The darkness did not move. The voice did not answer. Holmes continued, "You paid Margaret Vale through a false trust to keep her within reach and to keep her blame ready. You allowed Dr. Sorrel to chase a phantom because it kept her occupied. You used Elias Harrow's fear because fearful men obey." Harrow's face tightened, shame washing through him. Vale's eyes flashed, wounded and furious. Sorrel's gaze dropped for a moment, as if seeing her life's obsession suddenly from above and hating the view. Holmes's voice lowered. "And you used John Watson's surname," he said, "because you needed one more lever, one more threat, one more hook." Watson's chest tightened. The photograph again, his family's erased man, his surname used as a disguise to vanish. An old stain dragged out and pinned under candlelight. Holmes's eyes remained fixed on the darkness. "Step into the light," he said. The voice in the dark softened, "And if I do?" Holmes's reply was quiet and final. "Then Inspector Pike will," he said. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Pike moved. Watson heard fabric shift. Pike stepped away from the table, drawing a lantern from the wall hook near the door, an emergency lamp. He struck it once. The flame flared behind its glass, pushing a wider circle of light into the room. The darkness retreated. and within it stood a man Watson did not recognize at first, a man with a neat coat, gloved hands, and a face arranged into calm respectability. Not a brute, not a desperate criminal, a man who looked like he belonged in corridors where paperwork becomes fate. His eyes met Holmes's without flinching. Dr. Livia Sorrel inhaled sharply. "No," she whispered, and the sound was not denial but betrayal. Margaret Vale's face went white. "It's you," she said, voice flat with recognition that tasted like old poison. Harrow's breath hitched. "You," he stammered, unable to find the proper title. Pike's jaw clenched so hard the muscle jumped. "Stay where you are," he growled, and yet his voice carried no surprise, only resignation. The man smiled faintly, not warmly. "There," he said softly, "now we can stop pretending." Holmes's expression remained calm, but Watson saw the cold clarity in his eyes. "You are the liaison," Holmes said, "the one who doesn't exist." The man inclined his head. "I have worn many names," he said. "That is the advantage of being a function rather than a person." Sorrel's voice shook with restrained fury. "You ruined my father," she said, and it was not an accusation. It was a wound tearing open. The man's gaze flicked to her, almost bored. "Your father ruined himself," he replied, and the cruelty was not loud, it was surgical. "I simply documented it in the right place." Vale's hands trembled. "You paid me," she said, voice low. "You kept me like a dog on a chain." The man's smile faded. "I kept you alive," he said. Holmes's voice cut through, calm but edged now. "Thomas Rook," he said. The man's gaze shifted, and for the first time Watson saw a flicker, annoyance. "He was becoming inconvenient," the man said. Harrow made a strangled sound. "He was a man," he whispered. The liaison's eyes returned to Holmes. "And you," he said softly, "you are the only man in London who believes he can choose which truths survive." Holmes's gaze held him. "No," Holmes said quietly, "I am the man who admits that choice exists." The liaison's eyes narrowed. "Then read the final line," he said. "Prove your courage." Holmes looked down at the letter again. Watson watched him, heart hammering. The final page lay there like a loaded weapon, and Holmes's hand rested beside it with absolute steadiness. Holmes spoke softly. "You want me to speak a name," he said, "because you think naming is power. You have lived by that. You have ruined lives by that." The liaison's eyes gleamed. "Truth," he said. Holmes's voice stayed calm. "Not truth," he replied. "Control." Watson felt the moral fault line crack open. Holmes's old mercy, his temptation to treat people as footnotes in a solution. This was the moment the case had been driving toward, not merely solving who did it, but deciding what to do with what was known. Holmes lifted the letter and read one more section, just enough. He read the portion that exposed the liaison's method, his access, his involvement. He read the portion that tied him to the false trust payments, to the recatalogue, to the warmed seal, to the threat. Then Holmes stopped. He folded the letter deliberately, sealing the final page within the fold like a held breath. The liaison's eyes sharpened. "Read it," he said, voice tightening. Holmes met his gaze. "No," he said simply. Pike stepped forward, lantern held high. "That's enough," he snapped. "You're under arrest." The liaison laughed softly, bitter. "Arrest," he echoed. "Do you really think this ends in handcuffs, Inspector? It ends in silence. It always ends in silence." He moved suddenly, not toward the door, but toward the lamp on the table, as if to snuff it, to plunge them back into darkness, to reclaim the only realm where he had held power. Watson's revolver came free in the same breath, aimed not at the man's heart but at his shoulder, enough to stop without killing if possible. Yet Holmes moved too, swift as a striking snake. Holmes's hand shot out, catching the liaison's wrist mid-reach, twisting with practiced precision. The liaison gasped, not from pain alone, but from shock at being physically handled by a man he had expected to manipulate, not fight. Pike was on him a second later, gripping his arm, hauling him back. Vale stepped away from the table as if the air had suddenly become toxic. Sorrel stood rigid, eyes bright, face pale, with years collapsing into one moment. Harrow pressed a hand to his mouth, breathing shallowly. The liaison struggled briefly, then stilled, breathing hard, eyes still locked on Holmes. "You spared someone once," he said quietly, and the words slid into the room like a knife finding a familiar groove. "That was your mistake." Watson felt Holmes's grip tighten for a fraction of a second. The mercy again, the old decision. Holmes's voice was low. "It was my humanity," he said, "and you have mistaken humanity for weakness." The liaison's smile returned, thin and unpleasant. "You'll regret your mercy again," he murmured. Holmes's eyes were cold. "Perhaps," he said, "but not tonight." Pike dragged the liaison toward the door. The locks rattled. The corridor beyond swallowed them into dimness and echo. The windowless room was left with its small pool of lamplight again, the papers on the table like the remains of a storm. For a moment no one spoke. Then Sorrel's voice came out, raw and quiet. "It was never about preservation," she said, staring at the folded letter in Holmes's hand. "It was about rewriting." Holmes nodded faintly. "Yes," he said softly, "a man who believed truth is a weapon only the powerful deserve to hold." Vale's shoulders shook once, then steadied. "And we let him," she whispered. "We lived inside his story." Harrow's voice trembled. "What happens now?" he asked. Holmes looked at the folded letter. "Now," he said, "we decide what kind of truth we become." Watson swallowed, feeling the ache behind his ribs. "And my family?" he asked quietly. "The man who vanished under my surname." Holmes's gaze softened slightly. "Your family erased him because they believed forgetting was survival," he said. "But forgetting is never clean. It stains anyway. It simply stains in silence." Watson felt the weight of that. Acceptance, not neat explanation. The past could stain a name, yet it did not have to dictate a future. Facing it was its own rescue. Sorrel's eyes glistened. "And my father," she whispered. Holmes's voice was gentle. "You may never find a single author to hate," he said, "but you have found something truer, the shape of the system that harmed him. That knowledge is bitter, but it is honest." Vale looked at Holmes, suspicion and pain mingled. "And you," she said softly, "you won't read the final line." Holmes's gaze held hers. "No," he said, "because it would destroy an innocent life's remaining dignity, and because you do not heal a rot by spreading it." Watson watched him, and in that moment Holmes looked unusually reflective, less like a machine of deduction, and more like a man standing at the edge of his own temptation. He had solved the puzzle. He had trapped the culprit, and yet he had chosen not to make the truth into spectacle. Holmes exhaled, a quiet release. "The greatest danger," he said softly, "was never the blackmail ring. It was the temptation to treat people as footnotes in a solution." The lamp's flame steadied. Somewhere beyond the thick walls, footsteps and distant voices suggested the repository was waking from its forced darkness. They left the windowless room together, and when they stepped back into the corridor, the gaslights had been restored, faint, obedient, as if the building wished to pretend nothing had happened. Outside, dawn was not yet visible, but the night had thinned. The fog was lighter. The street lamps looked less like moons and more like tired lanterns near extinguishing. At 221B, the sitting room greeted them with its familiar warmth. Mrs. Hudson had stoked the fire. The kettle on the hob sang softly. The ordinary comforts of the room felt almost shocking after the windowless pressure of the repository. Harrow sank into a chair as if his bones had forgotten how to hold him. Vale stood near the mantel, staring into the fire without seeing it. Sorrel remained upright, composed by sheer will, but Watson could see the tremor in her breath. She looked like a woman who had spent a lifetime chasing one wound, only to discover it was part of her own blood. Watson sat slowly, his mind still holding the photograph's eyes, the erased relative, the truth his family had avoided. He felt no clean closure, but he felt something else, a quiet shift, as if the sealed compartment inside him had been acknowledged, not torn open. That was enough for now. Holmes went to the table, took out a small tin box, plain, battered, private. He placed the folded letter inside it carefully, not like evidence, but like a burden that must be carried responsibly. Then he closed the lid and turned the key. The click was soft. Watson watched him. "You're keeping it," he murmured. Holmes's gaze lingered on the tin box a moment. "I am keeping the choice," he said quietly. He lifted the box and set it in a drawer that Watson had never seen Holmes use. Then he closed the drawer. The fire settled with a gentle sigh. The rain outside had stopped entirely, leaving the street washed clean, as if London itself wished to forget the night's confession. Holmes stood near the hearth, hands loosely behind his back, posture calm again. Yet his voice, when he spoke, carried a rare softness. "Some archives are sealed for mercy," he murmured. Watson looked at the tin box's hidden drawer, then at the fire, then at Holmes. He understood then that one question would remain unanswered by choice, not because the answer could not be found, but because finding it was not the same as using it. And in the quiet warmth of 221B, with the city beginning to breathe toward morning, Watson realized that the real mystery had never been how a sealed letter escaped an archive. It was what a man does when the truth is finally in his hands.